The old statement that England acquired its empire in a fit of absent-mindedness is amusing but does not explain very much. It does, however, contain an element of truth. Much of the empire was acquired by private individuals and commercial firms, and was taken over by the British government much later. The motives which impelled the government to annex areas which its citizens had been exploiting were varied, both in time and in place, and were frequently much different from what an outsider might believe. Britain acquired the world's greatest empire because it possessed certain advantages which other countries lacked. We mention three of these advantages: 1. That it was an island, 2. That it was in the Atlantic, and 3. That its social traditions at home produced the will and the talents for imperial acquisition. As an island off the coast of Europe, Britain had security as long as it had control of the narrow seas. It had such control from the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 until the creation of new weapons based on air power in the period after 1935. The rise of the German air force under Hitler, the invention of the long-range rocket projectile V-2 weapon in 1944, and the development of the atomic and hydrogen bombs in 1945 to 1955 destroyed England's security by reducing the defensive effectiveness of the English Channel. But in the period 1588 to 1942, in which Britain controlled the seas, the Channel gave England security and made its international position entirely different from that of any continental power. Because Britain had security, it had freedom of action. That means it had a choice whether to intervene or to stay out of the various disputes which arose on the continent of Europe or elsewhere in the world. Moreover, if it intervened, it could do so on a limited commitment, restricting its contribution of men, energy, money, and wealth to whatever amount it wished. If such a limited commitment were exhausted or lost, so long as the British fleet controlled the seas, Britain had security, and thus had freedom to choose if it would break off its intervention or increase its commitment. Moreover, England could make even a small commitment of its resources of decisive importance by using this commitment in support of the second strongest power on the continent against the strongest power, thus hampering the strongest power and making the second power temporarily the strongest, as long as it acted in accord with Britain's wishes. In this way, by following balance of power tactics, Britain was able to play the decisive role on the continent, keep the continent divided and embroiled in its own disputes, and do this with a limited commitment of Britain's own resources, leaving a considerable surplus of energy, manpower, and wealth available for acquiring an empire overseas. In addition, Britain's unique advantage in having security through a limited commitment of resources by control of the sea was one of the contributing factors which allowed Britain to develop its unique social structure, its parliamentary system, its wide range of civil liberties, and its great economic advance. The powers on the continent had none of these advantages, since each could be invaded by its neighbors at any time. Each had security, and thus freedom of action, only on rare and brief occasions. When the security of a continental power was threatened by a neighbor, it had no freedom of action, but had to defend itself with all its resources. Clearly, it would be impossible for France to say to itself, "We shall oppose German hegemony on the continent only to the extent of 50,000 men or of $10 million. Yet as late as 1939, Chamberlain informed France that England's commitment on the continent for this purpose would be no more than 2 divisions. Since the continental powers had neither security nor freedom of action, their position on the continent always was paramount over their ambitions for world empire, and these latter always had to be sacrificed for the sake of the former whenever a conflict arose. France was unable to hold on to its possessions in India or in North America in the 18th century because so much of its resources had to be used to bolster French security against Prussia or Austria. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803 because his primary concern had to be his position on the continent. Bismarck tried to discourage Germany from embarking on any overseas adventures in the period after 1871 because he saw that Germany must be a continental power or be nothing. Again, France in 1882 had to yield Egypt to Britain, and in 1898 had to yield the Sudan in the same way, because it saw that it could not engage in any colonial dispute with Britain while the German army stood across the Rhineland. This situation was so clear that all the lesser continental powers with overseas colonial possessions, such as Portugal, Belgium, or the Netherlands, had to collaborate with Britain, or, at the very least, be carefully neutral. So long as the ocean highway from these countries to their overseas empires was controlled by the British fleet, they could not afford to embark on a policy hostile to Britain, regardless of their personal feelings on the subject. It is no accident that Britain's most constant international backing in the 2 centuries following the Methuen Treaty of 1703 came from Portugal, and that Britain has felt free to negotiate with a third power, like Germany, regarding the disposition of the Portuguese colonies, as she did in 1898 and tried to do in 1937 to 1939. Britain's position on the Atlantic, combined with her naval control of the sea, gave her a great advantage when the new lands to the west of that ocean became one of the chief sources of commercial and naval wealth in the period after 1588. Lumber, tar, and ships were supplied from the American colonies to Britain in the period before the advent of iron, steam-driven ships after 1860, and these ships helped to establish Britain's mercantile supremacy. At the same time, Britain's insular position deprived her monarchy of any need for a large professional, mercenary army such as the kings on the continent used as the chief bulwark of royal absolutism. As a result, the kings of England were unable to prevent the landed gentry from taking over the control of the government in the period 1642 to 1690, and the kings of England became constitutional monarchs. Britain's security behind her navy allowed this struggle to go to a decision without any important outside interference, and permitted a rivalry between monarch and aristocracy which would have been suicidal on the insecure grounds of continental Europe. Britain's security combined with the political triumph of the landed oligarchy to create a social tradition entirely unlike that on the continent. One result of these two factors was that England did not obtain a bureaucracy such as appeared on the continent. This lack of a separate bureaucracy loyal to the monarch can be seen in the weakness of the professional army already mentioned and also in the lack of a bureaucratic judicial system. In England, the gentry and the younger sons of the landed oligarchy studied law in the Inns of Court and obtained a feeling for tradition and the sanctity of due process of law while still remaining a part of the landed class. In fact, this class became the landed class in England just because they obtained control of the bar and the bench and were, thus, in a position to judge all disputes about real property in their own favour. Control of the courts and of the Parliament made it possible for this ruling group in England to override the rights of the peasants in land, to eject them from the land, to enclose the open fields of the medieval system, to deprive the cultivators of their manorial rights and thus to reduce them to the condition of landless rural labourers or of tenants. This advance of the enclosure movement in England made possible the agricultural revolution, greatly depopulated the rural areas of England as described in the deserted village of Oliver Goldsmith, and provided a surplus population for the cities, the mercantile and naval marine, and for overseas colonization. The landed oligarchy which arose in England differed from the landed aristocracy of continental Europe in the 3 points already mentioned. 1. It got control of the government. 2. It was not opposed by a professional army, a bureaucracy, or a professional judicial system, but, on the contrary, it took over the control of these adjuncts of government itself, generally serving without pay, and making access to these positions difficult for outsiders by making such access expensive. And 3. It obtained complete control of the land as well as political, religious, and social control of the villages. In addition, the landed oligarchy of England was different from that on the continent because it was not the nobility. This lack was reflected in 3 important factors. On the continent, the noble was excluded from marrying outside his class or from engaging in commercial enterprise. Moreover, access to the nobility by persons of non-noble birth was very difficult, and could hardly be achieved in much less than 3 generations. In England, the landed oligarchy could engage in any kind of commerce or business and could marry anyone without question provided she was rich. Moreover, while access to the gentry in England was a slow process which might require generations of effort acquiring land holdings in a single locality, access to the peerage by act of the government took only a moment, and could be achieved on the basis of either wealth or service. As a consequence of all these differences, the landed upper class in England was open to the influx of new talent, new money, and new blood. while the continental nobility was deprived of these valuable acquisitions. While the landed upper class of England was unable to become a nobility, that is, a caste based on exalted birth, it was able to become an aristocracy, that is, an upper class distinguished by traditions and behavior. The chief attributes of this aristocratic upper class in England were: 1. That it should be trained in an expensive, exclusive, masculine, and relatively Spartan educational system centering about the great boys' schools like Eton, Harrow, or Winchester. 2. That it should imbibe from this educational system certain distinctive attitudes of leadership, courage, sportsmanship, team play, self-sacrifice, disdain for physical comforts, and devotion to duty. 3. That it should be prepared in later life to devote a great deal of time and energy to unpaid tasks of public significance, as justices of the peace, on county councils, in the county militia, or in other services. Since all the sons of the upper classes received the same training, while only the oldest, by primogeniture, was entitled to take over the income-yielding property of the family, all the younger sons had to go out into the world to seek their fortunes, and, as likely as not, would do their seeking overseas. At the same time, the uneventful life of the typical English village or county, completely controlled by the upper-class oligarchy, made it necessary for the more ambitious members of the lower classes to seek advancement outside the county and even outside England. From these two sources were recruited the men who acquired Britain's empire and the men who colonized it. The English have not always been unanimous in regarding the empire as a source of pride and benefit. In fact, the middle generation of the 19th century was filled with persons, such as Gladstone, who regarded the empire with profound suspicion. They felt that it was a source of great expense. They were convinced that it involved England in remote strategic problems which could easily lead to wars England had no need to fight. They could see no economic advantage in having an empire, since the existence of free trade, which this generation accepted, would allow commerce to flow no matter who held colonial areas. They were convinced that any colonial areas, no matter at what cost they might be acquired, would eventually separate from the mother country, voluntarily if they were given the rights of Englishmen, or by rebellion, as the American colonies had done, if they were deprived of such rights. In general, the Little Englanders, as they were called, were averse to colonial expansion on the grounds of cost. Although upholders of the Little England point of view, men like Gladstone or Sir William Harcourt, continued in political prominence until 1895, this point of view was in steady retreat after 1870. In the Liberal Party, the Little Englanders were opposed by imperialists like Lord Rosebery even before 1895. After that date, the younger group of imperialists, like Asquith, Grey, and Haldane, took over the party. In the Conservative Party, where the anti-imperialist idea had never been strong, Moderate imperialists like Lord Salisbury were followed by more active imperialists like Joseph Chamberlain, or Lords Curzon, Selborne, and Milner. There were many factors which led to the growth of imperialism after 1870, and many obvious manifestations of that growth. The Royal Colonial Institute was founded in 1868 to fight the Little England idea. Disraeli as Prime Minister 1874–1880 dramatized the profit and glamour of empire by such acts as the purchase of control of the Suez Canal and by granting Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India. After 1870 it became increasingly evident that, however expensive colonies might be to a government, they could be fantastically profitable to individuals and companies supported by such governments. Moreover, with the spread of democracy and the growing influence of the press and the expanding need for campaign contributions, individuals who made fantastic profits in overseas adventures could obtain favorable support from their governments by contributing some part of their profits to politicians' expenses. The efforts of King Leopold of Belgium, using Henry Stanley, to obtain the Congo area as his own preserve in 1876–1880, started a contagious fever of colony grabbing. In Africa, which lasted for more than 30 years, the discovery of diamonds in 1869 and of gold in 1886 in South Africa, especially in the Boer Transvaal Republic, intensified this fever. The new imperialism after 1870 was quite different in tone from that which the Little Englanders had opposed earlier. The chief changes were that it was justified on grounds of moral duty and of social reform and not, as earlier, on grounds of missionary activity and material advantage. The man most responsible for this change was John Ruskin. Until 1870 there was no professorship of fine arts at Oxford, but in that year, thanks to the slave bequest, John Ruskin was named to such a chair. He hit Oxford like an earthquake, not so much because he talked about fine arts, but because he talked also about the Empire and England's downtrodden masses, and above all because he talked about all three of these things as moral issues. Until the end of the 19th century the poverty-stricken masses in the cities of England lived in want, ignorance, and crime very much as they have been described by Charles Dickens. Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged, ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, and self-discipline, but that this tradition could not be saved, and did not deserve to be saved, unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself and to the non-English masses throughout the world. If this precious tradition were not extended to these two great majorities, the minority of upper-class Englishmen would ultimately be submerged by these majorities and the tradition lost. To prevent this, the tradition must be extended to the masses and to the empire. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Rhodes 1853–1902 feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa, rose to be Prime Minister of the Cape Colony 1890–1896, contributed money to political parties, controlled parliamentary seats both in England and in South Africa, and sought to win the strip of British territory across Africa from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line and ultimately with a Cape to Cairo railway. Rhodes inspired devoted support for his goals from others in South Africa and in England. With financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Beit, he was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers consolidated mines and to build up a great gold mining enterprise as Consolidated Goldfields. In the middle 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million sterling a year, then about $5 million, which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his account. These purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin had wanted. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred Later Lord Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, George Later Sir George Parkin, Philip Lyttelton Gell, and Henry Later Sir Henry Birchie Noof. These were so moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out his ideas. A similar group of Cambridge men including Reginald Balliol bred Lord Esher, Sir John B.C. Albert Lord Great, and Edmund Garrett were also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to extension of the British Empire and uplift of England's urban masses as two parts of one project, which they called extension of the English-speaking idea. They were remarkably successful in these aims because England's most sensational journalist William T. Stead (1849–1912), an ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought them into association with Rhodes. This association was formally established on February 5, 1891. When Rhodes and Stead organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming for 16 years. In this secret society Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, bred Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Lord Balfour, Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Great, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization. Brett was invited to join this organization the same day, and Milner a couple of weeks later, on his return from Egypt. Both accepted with enthusiasm. Thus the central part of the secret society was established by March 1891. It continued to function as a formal group, although the outer circle was, apparently, not organized until 1909 to 1913. This group was able to get access to Rhodes's money after his death in 1902 and also to the funds of loyal Rhodes supporters like Alfred Beit (1853–1906) and Sir Abe Bailey (1864–1940). Was this backing they sought to extend and execute the ideals that Rhodes had obtained from Ruskin and Stead. Milner was the chief Rhodes trustee and Parkin was organizing secretary of the Rhodes Trust after 1902, while Gell and Birchie Knopf, as well as others with similar ideas, became officials of the British South Africa Company. They were joined in their efforts by other Ruskinite friends of Stead like Lord Grey, Lord Esher, and Flora Shaw, later Lady Lugard. In 1890, by a stratagem too elaborate to describe here, Miss Shaw became head of the colonial department of the Times while still remaining on the payroll of Stead's Pall Mall Gazette. In this post she played a major role in the next 10 years in carrying into execution the Imperial schemes of Cecil Rhodes, to whom Stead had introduced her in 1889. In the meantime, in 1884, acting under Ruskin's inspiration, the group, which included Arnold Toynbee, Milner, Gell, Grey, C. Lee, and Michael Glazebrook, founded the first settlement house, an organization by which educated, upper-class people could live in the slums in order to assist, instruct, and guide the poor, with particular emphasis on social welfare and adult education. The new enterprise, set up in East London with P. L. Gell as chairman, was named Toynbee Hall after Arnold Toynbee, who died, aged 31, in 1883. This was the original model for the thousands of settlement houses, such as Hull House in Chicago, now found throughout the world, and was one of the seeds from which the modern movement for adult education and university extension grew. As Governor-General and High Commissioner of South Africa in the period 1897 to 1905, Milner recruited a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and from Toynbee Hall, to assist him in organizing his administration. Through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance and became the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner in South Africa they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 to 1913 they organized semi-secret groups, known as Round Table groups, in the chief British dependencies and the United States. These still function in 8 countries. They kept in touch with each other by personal correspondence and frequent visits, and through an influential quarterly magazine, The Round Table, founded in 1910 and largely supported by Sir Abe Bailey's money. In 1919 they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, for which the chief financial supporters were Sir Abe Bailey and the Astor family, owners of the Times. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations in the period 1919 to 1927. After 1925, a somewhat similar structure of organizations, known as the Institute of Pacific Relations, was set up in 12 countries holding territory in the Pacific area, the units in each British Dominion existing on an interlocking basis with the Round Table Group and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In the same country, in Canada, the nucleus of this group consisted of Milner's undergraduate friends at Oxford such as Arthur Glazebrook and George Parkin, while in South Africa and India the nucleus was made up of former members of Milner's kindergarten. These included Sir Patrick Duncan, B.K. Long, Richard Feetham, and Sir Dougal Malcolm in South Africa, and Sir William Mattis, James Lord Meston, and their friend Malcolm Lord Haley in India. The groups in Australia and New Zealand had been recruited by Stead through his magazine The Review of Reviews as early as 1890 to 1893, by Parkin, at Milner instigation, in the period 1889 to 1910, and by Lionel Curtis, also at Milner's request, in 1910 to 1919. The power and influence of this Rhodes-Milner group in British imperial affairs and in foreign policy since 1889, although not widely recognized, can hardly be exaggerated. We might mention as an example that this group dominated the Times from 1890 to 191, and has controlled it completely since 1912 except for the years 1919 to 1922. Because the Times has been owned by the Astor family since 1922, this Rhodes-Milner group was sometimes spoken of as the Cliveden set, named after the Astor country house where they sometimes assembled. Numerous other papers and journals have been under the control or influence of this group since 1889. They have also established and influenced numerous university and other chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these are the Beit chairs at Oxford, a Montagu Burton chair at Oxford, the Rhodes chair at London, the Stevenson chair at Chatham House, the Wilson chair at Aberystwyth, and others, as well as such important sources of influence as Rhodes House at Oxford. From 1884 to about 1915 the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it in a federal system. They were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution and the success of the Canadian Federation of 1867, and hoped to federate the various parts of the empire as seemed feasible, then confederate the whole of it, with the United Kingdom, into a single organization. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Stead was able to get Rhodes to accept, in principle, a solution which might have made Washington the capital of the whole organization or allow parts of the empire to become states of the American Union. The varied character of the British imperial possessions, the backwardness of many of the native peoples involved, the independence of many of the white colonists overseas, and the growing international tension which culminated in the First World War made it impossible to carry out the plan for imperial federation, although The 5 colonies in Australia were joined into the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, and the 4 colonies in South Africa were joined into the Union of South Africa in 1910. Disraeli's purchase, with Rothschild money, of 176,602 shares of Suez final stock for £3,680,000 from the Caliph of Egypt in 1875 was motivated by concern for the British communications with India, just as the British acquisition of the Cape of Good Hope in 1814 had resulted from the same concern. But in imperial matters one step leads to another, and every acquisition obtained to protect an earlier acquisition requires a new advance at a later date to protect it. This was clearly true in Africa, where such motivations gradually extended British control southward from Egypt and northward from the Cape until these were joined in Central Africa with the conquest of German Tanganyika in 1916. The extravagances of the Caliph's model 1863–1879, which had compelled the sale of his Suez Canal shares, led ultimately to the creation of an Anglo-French condominium to manage the Egyptian foreign debt, and to the deposition of the Caliph by his suzerain, the Sultan of Turkey. The condominium led to disputes and finally to open fighting between Egyptian nationalists and Anglo-French forces. When the French refused to join the British in a joint bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, the condominium was broken, and Britain reorganized the country in such a fashion that, while all public positions were held by Egyptians, the British Army was in occupation. British advisers controlled all the chief governmental posts, and a British president, Sir Evelyn Baring, known as Lord Cromer after 1892, controlled all finances and really ruled the country until 1907. Inspired by fanatical Muslim religious agitators, dervishes, the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmed led a Sudanese revolt against Egyptian control in 1883, massacred the British force under General Charles Chinese Gordon at Khartoum, and maintained an independent Sudan for 15 years. In 1898 the British force under Lord Kitchener, seeking to protect the Nile water supply of Egypt, fought its way southward against fanatical Sudanese tribesmen and won the decisive victory at Omdurman. An Anglo-Egyptian convention established a condominium known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan in the area between Egypt and the Congo River. This area, which had lived in disorder for centuries, was gradually pacified, brought under the rule of law, irrigated by extensive hydraulic works, and brought under cultivation, producing chiefly long staple cotton. South and east of the Sudan, the struggle for a British Africa was largely in the hands of H. Sir Harry Johnston (1858–1927) and Frederick later Lord Lugard (1858–1945). These two, chiefly using private funds but frequently holding official positions, fought all over tropical Africa, ostensibly seeking to pacify it and to wipe out the Arab slave trade, but always possessing a burning desire to extend British rule. Frequently, These ambitions led to rivalries with supporters of French and German ambitions in the same regions. In 1884 Johnston obtained many concessions from native chiefs in the Carroll area, turning these over to the British East Africa Company in 1887. When this company went bankrupt in 895, most of its rights were taken over by the British government. In the meantime, Johnston had moved south, into a chaos of Arab slavers' intrigues and native unrest in Nyasaland 1888. Here his exploits were largely financed by Rhodes 1889 to 1893 in order to prevent the Portuguese Mozambique Company from pushing westward toward the Portuguese West African colony of Angola to block the Cape to Cairo route. Lord Salisbury made Nyasaland the British protectorate after a deal with Rhodes in which the South African promised to pay £1,000 a year toward the cost of the new territory. About the same time Rhodes gave the Liberal Party a substantial financial contribution in return for a promise that they would not abandon Egypt. He had already 1888 given £10,000 to the Irish Home Rule Party on condition that it seek Home Rule for Ireland while keeping Irish members in the British Parliament as a step toward Imperial Federation. Rhodes's plans received the terrible blow in 1890–1891 when Lord Salisbury sought to end the African disputes with Germany and Portugal by delimiting their territorial claims in South and East Africa. The Portuguese Agreement of 1891 was never ratified, but the Anglo-German Agreement of 1890 blocked Rhodes's route to Egypt by extending German East Africa Tanganyika west to the Belgian Congo. By the same agreement Germany abandoned Nyasaland, Uganda, and Zanzibar to Britain in return for the island of Heligoland in the Baltic Sea and an advantageous boundary in German Southwest Africa. As soon as the German agreement was published, Lugard was sent by the British East Africa Company to overcome the resistance of native chiefs and slavers in Uganda 1890–1894. The bankruptcy of this company in 1895 seemed likely to lead to the abandonment of Uganda because of the Little Englander sentiment in the Liberal Party which was in office in 1892–1895. Rhodes offered to take the area over himself and run it for £25,000 a year, but was refused. As a result of complex and secret negotiations in which Lord Rosebery was the chief figure, Britain kept Uganda. Rhodes was made the Privy Councillor. Rosebery replaced his father-in-law, Lord Rothschild, in Rhodes's secret group and was made the trustee under Rhodes's next and last will. Rosebery tried to obtain a route for Rhodes's railway to the north across the Belgian Congo. Rosebery was informed of Rhodes's plans to finance an uprising of the English within the Transvaal Boer Republic and to send Dr. Jameson on a raid into that country to restore order and, finally, Rhodes found the money to finance Kitchener's railway from Egypt to Uganda, using the South African gauge and engines given by Rhodes. The economic strength which allowed Rhodes to do these things rested in his diamond and gold mines, the latter in the Transvaal, and thus not in British territory. North of Cape Colony, across the Orange River, was a Boer republic, the Orange Free State. Beyond this, and separated by the Vaal River, was another Boer republic, the Transvaal. Beyond this, across the Limpopo River and continuing northward to the Zambezi River, was the savage native kingdom of the Matabele's. With great personal daring, unscrupulous opportunism, and extravagant expenditure of money, Rhodes obtained an opening to the north, passing west of the Boer republics, by getting British control in Griqualand West 1880 Bechuanaland, and the Bechuanaland Protectorate 1885. In 1888 Rhodes obtained a vague but extensive mining concession from the Matabele's chief, Lobengula, and gave it to the British South Africa Company organized for the purpose 1889. Rhodes obtained a charter so worded that the company had very extensive powers in an area without any northern limits beyond Bechuanaland Protectorate. 4 years later the Matabele's were attacked and destroyed by Dr. Jameson, and their lands taken by the company. The company, however, was not a commercial success, and paid no dividends for 35 years 1889 to 1924 at only 12.5 shillings in 46 years. This compares with 793.5% dividends paid by Rhodes's consolidated goldfields in the 5 years 1889 to 1894 and the 125% dividend paid in 1896. Most of the South Africa Company's money was used on public improvements like roads and schools, and no rich mines were found in its territory known as Rhodesia compared to those farther south in the Transvaal. In spite of the terms of the Rhodes Wills, Rhodes himself was not a racist, nor was he a political Democrat. He worked as easily and as closely with Jews, black natives, or Boers as he did with English. But he had a passionate belief in the value of a liberal education, and was attached to a restricted suffrage and even to a non-secret ballot. In South Africa he was a staunch friend of the Dutch and of the blacks, found his chief political support among the Boers, until at least 1895, and wanted restrictions on natives put on an educational rather than on a colour basis. These ideas have generally been held by his group since and have played an important role in British Imperial history. His greatest weakness rested on the fact that his passionate attachment to his goals made him overly tolerant in regard to methods. He did not hesitate to use either bribery or force to attain his ends if he judged they would be effective. This weakness led to his greatest errors: the Jameson Raid of 1895 and the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, errors which were disastrous for the future of the empire he loved. By 1895 the Transvaal Republic presented an acute problem. All political control was in the hands of a rural, backward, Bible-reading, racist minority of Boers, while all economic wealth was in the hands of a violent, aggressive majority of foreigners, Uitlanders, most of whom lived in the new city of Johannesburg. The Uitlanders, who were twice as numerous as the Boers and owned 2/3 of the land and 9/10 of the wealth of the country, were prevented from participating in political life or from becoming citizens except after 14 years residence, and were irritated by a series of minor pinpricks and extortions such as tax differentials, a dynamite monopoly, and transportation restrictions, and by rumors that the Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, was intriguing to obtain some kind of German intervention and protection. At this point in 1895, Rhodes made his plans to overthrow Kruger's government by an uprising in Johannesburg, financed by himself and Beit, and led by his brother Frank Rhodes, A. Bailey, and other supporters, followed by an invasion of the Transvaal by a force led by Jameson from Bechuanaland and Rhodesia. Flora used the times to prepare public opinion in England, while Albert Great and others negotiated with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain for the official support that was necessary. Unfortunately, when the revolt fizzled out in Johannesburg, Jameson raided anyway in an effort to revive it, and was easily captured by the Boers. The public officials involved denounced the plot, loudly proclaimed their surprise at the event, and were able to whitewash most of the participants in the subsequent parliamentary inquiry. The telegram from the German Kaiser to President Kruger of the Transvaal, congratulating him on his success in preserving the independence of his country without the need to call for aid from his friends, was built up by the Times into an example of brazen German interference in British affairs, and almost eclipsed Jameson's aggression. Rhodes was stopped only temporarily, but he had lost the support of many of the Boers. For almost 2 years he and his friends stayed quiet, waiting for the storm to blow over. Then they began to act again. Propaganda, most of it true, about the plight of Uitlanders in the Transvaal Republic flooded England and South Africa from Flora Shaw, W. T. Stead, Edmund Garrett, and others. Milner was made High Commissioner of South Africa 1897. Brett worked his way into the confidence of the monarchy to become its chief political advisor during a period of more than 25 years. He wrote almost daily letters of advice to King Edward during his reign, 1901 to 1910. By a process whose details are still obscure, the brilliant young graduate of Cambridge, January Smuts, who had been a vigorous supporter of Rhodes and acted as his agent in Kimberley as late as 1895, and who was one of the most important members of the Rhodes-Milner group in the period 1908 to 1950, went to the Transvaal and, by violent anti-British agitation, became State Secretary of that country. Although the British subject and chief political advisor to President Kruger, Milner made provocative troop movements on the Boer frontiers in spite of the vigorous protests of his commanding general in South Africa, who had to be removed, and, finally, war was precipitated when Smuts drew up an ultimatum insisting that the British troop movements cease, and when this was rejected by Milner, The Boer War 1899–1902 was one of the most important events in British Imperial history. The ability of 40,000 Boer farmers to hold off 10 times as many British for 3 years, inflicting a series of defeats on them over that period, destroyed faith in British power. Although the Boer republics were defeated and annexed in 1902, Britain's confidence was so shaken that it made a treaty with Japan in the same year, providing that if either signer became engaged in war with two enemies in the Far East, the other signer would come to the rescue. This treaty, which allowed Japan to attack Russia in 1904, lasted for 20 years, being extended to the Middle East in 1912. At the same time, Germany's obvious sympathy with the Boers, combined with the German naval construction program of 1900, alienated the British people from the Germans and contributed greatly toward the Anglo-French Entente of 1904. Milner took over the two defeated Boer republics and administered them as occupied territories until 1905, using a civil service of young men recruited for the purpose. This group, known as Milner's Kindergarten, reorganized the government and administration of the Transvaal and Orange River colony and played a major role in South African life generally. When Milner left public life in 1905 to devote himself to international finance and the Rhodes enterprises, Lord Selborne, his successor as High Commissioner, took over the kindergarten and continued to use it. In 1906, the new Liberal government in London granted self-government to the two Boer states. The kindergarten spent the next 4 years in a successful effort to create a South African federation. The task was not an easy one, even with such powerful backing as Selborne. Smuts, who was now the dominant political figure in the Transvaal, although Botha held the position of Prime Minister, and Jameson, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in 1904 to 1908. The subject was broached through a pre-arranged public interchange of letters between Jameson and Selborne. Then Selborne published a memorandum, written by Philip Curlodian and Lionel Curtis, calling for a union of the 4 colonies. Kerr funded a periodical The State, financed by Sir Abe Bailey, which advocated federation in every issue. Curtis and others scurried about organizing closer union societies. Robert H. Lord Brand and Sir Patrick Duncan laid the groundwork for the new constitution. At the Durban Constitutional Convention, where Duncan and B.K. Long were legal advisers, the Transvaal delegation was controlled by Smuts and the kindergarten. This delegation, which was heavily financed, tightly organized, and knew exactly what it wanted, dominated the convention, wrote the Constitution for the Union of South Africa, and succeeded in having it ratified 1910. Local animosities were compromised in a series of ingenious arrangements, including one by which the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the new government were placed in 3 different cities. The Rhodes-Milner Group recognized that Boer nationalism and color intolerance were threats to the future stability and loyalty of South Africa, but they had faith in the political influence of Smuts and Botha, of Rhodes's allies, and the 4 members of the kindergarten who stayed in South Africa to hold off these problems until time could moderate the irreconcilable Boers. In this they were mistaken, because, as men like Jameson 1917, Botha 1919, Duncan 1943, Long 1943 and Smuts 1950 died off, they were not replaced by men of equal loyalty and ability, with the result that the Boer extremists under D.F. Malan came to power in 1948. The first cabinet of the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910 by the South African Party, which was largely Boer, with Louis Botha as Prime Minister. The real master of the government was Smuts, who held 3 out of 9 portfolios, all important ones, and completely dominated Botha. Their policy of reconciliation with the English and of loyal support for the British connection was violently opposed by the Boer nationalists within the party led by J.B.M. Hertzog. Hertzog was eager to get independence from Britain and to reserve political control in a South African republic to Boers only. He obtained growing support by agitating on the language and educational issues, insisting that all government officials must speak Afrikaans and that it be a compulsory language in schools, with English a voluntary second language. The opposition party, known as Unionist, was largely English and was led by Jameson, supported by Duncan, Richard Feetham, Hugh Wyndham, and Long, financed by Milner's allies and the Rhodes Trust. Its leaders considered that their chief task was to support the Prime Minister against the extremists of his own party. Long, as the best speaker, was ordered to attack Hertzog constantly. When Hertzog struck back with too violent language in 1912, he was dropped from the cabinet and soon seceded from the South African Party, joining with the irreconcilable Boer Republicans like Christiaan de Wet to form the Nationalist Party. The new party adopted an extremist anti-English and anti-native platform. Jameson's party, under his successor, Sir Thomas Smart, a paid agent of the Rhodes Organization, had dissident elements because of the growth of white labor unions which insisted on anti-native legislation. By 1914 these formed a separate Labour Party under F.H.P. Creswell, and were able to win from Smuts a law excluding natives from most semi-skilled or skilled work for any high-paying positions. 1911. The natives were compelled to work for wages, however low, by the need to obtain cash for taxes and by the inadequacy of the native reserves to support them from their own agricultural activities. By the Land Act of 1913 about 7% of the land area was reserved for future land purchases by natives and the other 93% for purchase by whites. At that time the native population exceeded the whites by at least fourfold. As a result of such discriminations, the wages of natives were about 1/10 those of whites. This discrepancy in remuneration permitted white workers to earn salaries comparable to those earned in North America, although national income was low and productivity per capita was very low, about $125 per year. The Botha-Smuts government of 1910 to 1924 did little to cope with the almost insoluble problems which faced South Africa. As it became weaker, and the Hertzog nationalists grew stronger, it had to rely with increasing frequency on the support of the Unionist Party. In 1920 a coalition was formed, and 3 members of the Unionist Party, including Duncan, took seats in Smuts's cabinet. In the next election in 1924, Cresswell's Labourites and Hertzog's Nationalists formed an agreement which dropped the Republic and Imperial issue and emphasized the importance of economic and native questions. This alliance defeated Smuts's party and formed a cabinet which held office for 9 years. It was replaced in March 1933 by a Smuts-Hertzog coalition formed to deal with the economic crisis arising from the World Depression of 1929 to 1935. The defeat of the Smuts group in 1924 resulted from 4 factors, besides his own imperious personality. These were 1. His violence toward labor unions and strikers, 2. His strong support for the Imperial connection, especially during the War of 1914 to 1918, 3. His refusal to show any enthusiasm for an anti-native program, and 4. The economic hardships of the post-war depression and the droughts of 1919 to 1923. A miners' strike in 1913 was followed by a general strike in 1914. In both, Smuts used martial law and machine gun bullets against the strikers, and in the latter case illegally deported 9 Union leaders to England. This problem had hardly subsided before the government entered the war against Germany and actively participated in the conquest of German Africa as well as in the fighting in France. Opposition from Boer extremists to this evidence of the English connection was so violent that it resulted in open revolt against the government and mutiny by various military contingents which sought to join the small German forces in southwest Africa. The rebels were crushed, and thousands of their supporters lost their political rights for 10 years. Botha and, even more, Smuts played major roles in the Imperial War Cabinet in London and at the Peace Conference of 1919. The former died as soon as he returned home, leaving Smuts, as Prime Minister, to face the acute post-war problems. The economic collapse of 1920 to 1923 was especially heavy in South Africa as the ostrich, feather and diamond markets were wiped out. The gold and export markets were badly injured, and years of drought were prevalent. Efforts to reduce costs in the mines by increased use of native labor led to strikes and eventually to a revolution on the Rand 1922. Over 200 rebels were killed. As a result, the popularity of Smuts in his own country reached a low ebb just at the time when he was being praised almost daily in England as one of the world's greatest men. These political shifts in South Africa's domestic affairs did little to relieve any of the acute economic and social problems which faced that country. On the contrary, these grew worse year by year. In 1921 the Union had only 1.5 million whites, 4.7 million natives, 545,000 mulattoes, colored, and 166,000 Indians. By 1936 the whites had increased by only 500,000, while the number of natives had gone up almost 2 million. These natives lived on inadequate and eroded reserves or in horrible urban slums, and were drastically restricted in movements, residence, or economic opportunities, and had almost no political or even civil rights. By 1950 most of the native workers of Johannesburg lived in a distant suburb where 90,000 Africans were crowded onto 600 acres of shacks with no sanitation, with almost no running water, and with such inadequate bus service that they had to stand in line for hours to get a bus into the city to work. In this way the natives were steadily detribalized, abandoning allegiance to their own customs and beliefs, including religion, without assuming the customs or beliefs of the whites. Indeed, they were generally excluded from this because of the obstacles placed in their path to education or property ownership. The result was that the natives were steadily ground downward to the point where they were denied all opportunity except for animal survival and reproduction. Almost half of the whites and many of the blacks were farmers, but agricultural practices were so deplorable that water shortages and erosion grew with frightening rapidity, and rivers which had flowed steadily in 1880 largely disappeared by 1950. As lands became too dry to farm, they were turned to grazing, especially under the spur of high wool prices during the two Great Wars, but the soil continued to drift away as dust. Because of low standards of living for the blacks, there was little domestic market either for farm products or for industrial goods. As a result, most products of both black and white labor were exported, the receipts being used to pay for goods which were locally unavailable or for luxuries for whites. But most of the export trade was precarious. The gold mines and diamond mines had to dig so deeply below 7,000-foot levels that costs arose sharply, while the demand for both products fluctuated widely, since neither was a necessity of life. Nonetheless, each year over half of the Union's annual production of all goods was exported, with about one-third of the total represented by gold. The basic problem was lack of labor, not so much the lack of hands but the low level of productivity of those hands. This in turn resulted from lack of capitalization and from the color bar, which refused to allow native labor to become skilled. Moreover, the cheapness of unskilled labor, especially on the farms, meant that most work was left to blacks, and many whites fell into lazy habits. Unskilled whites, unwilling and unable to compete as labor with the blacks, became indolent poor whites. Milner's kindergarten had, at the end of the Boer War, the sum of £3 million provided by the peace treaty to be used to restore Boer families from concentration camps to their farms. They were shocked to discover that 1/10 of the Boers were poor whites, had no land and wanted none. The kindergarten decided that this sad condition resulted from the competition of cheap black labor, a conclusion which was incorporated into the report of a commission established by Selborne to study the problem. This famous report of the Transvaal Indigency Commission, published in 1908, was written by Philip Curlodian and republished by the Union government 20 years later. About the same time, the group became convinced that black labor not only demoralized white labor and prevented it from acquiring the physical skills necessary for self-reliance and high personal morale, but that blacks were capable of learning such skills as well as whites were. As Curtis expressed it in 1952, "I came to see how the color bar reacted on whites and blacks. Exempt from drudgery by custom and law, whites acquire no skill in crafts, because the school of skill is drudgery. The blacks, by doing drudgery, acquire skill. All skilled work in mines such as rock drilling was done by miners imported from Cornwall who worked subject to the colour bar. The heavy drills were fixed and driven under their direction by natives. These Cornish miners earned £1 a day, the natives about 2s. The Cornish miner struck for higher pay, but the blacks, who in doing the drudgery had learned how to work the drills, kept the mines running at a lower cost. Accordingly, the Milner Round Table Group worked out a scheme to reserve the tropical portions of Africa north of the Zambezi River for natives under such attractive conditions that the blacks south of that river would be enticed to migrate northward. As Curtis envisioned this plan, an international state or administrative body would take over the British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese dependencies in tropical Africa. Its policy would be to found north of the Zambezi a Negro Dominion in which blacks could own land, enter professions, and stand on a footing of equality with whites. The inevitable consequence would be that black laborers south of the Zambezi would rapidly emigrate from South Africa and leave South African whites to do their own drudgery, which would be the salvation of the whites. Although this project has not been achieved, it provides the key to Britain's native and Central African policies from 1917 onward. For example, in 19,371,939 Britain made many vain efforts to negotiate a settlement of Germany's colonial claims under which Germany would renounce forever its claims on Tanganyika and be allowed to participate as a member of an international administration of all tropical Africa including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola, as well as British and French territory as a single unit in which native rights would be paramount. The British tradition of fair conduct toward natives and non-whites generally was found most frequently among the best educated of the English upper class and among those lower class groups, such as missionaries, where religious influences were strongest. This tradition was greatly strengthened by the actions of the Rhodes-Milner Group, especially after 1920. Rhodes aroused considerable ill-feeling among the whites of South Africa when he announced that his program included equal rights for all civilized men south of the Zambezi, and went on to indicate that civilized men included ambitious, literate Negroes. When Milner took over the Boer States in 1901, he tried to follow the same policy, The peace treaty of 1902 promised that the native franchise would not be forced on the defeated Boers, but Milner tried to organize the governments of municipalities, beginning with Johannesburg, so that natives could vote. This was blocked by the kindergarten led by Curtis, who was in charge of municipal reorganization in 1901 to 1906, because they considered reconciliation with the Boers as a preliminary to a South African Union to be more urgent. Similarly, Smuts, as the chief political figure in South Africa after 1910, had to play down native rights in order to win Boer and English Labour support for the rest of his program. The Rhodes-Milner Group, however, was in a better position to carry out its plans in the non-self-governing portions of Africa outside the Union. In South Africa, the three native protectorates of Swaziland, Bechuanaland, and Basutoland were retained by the imperial authorities as areas where native rights were paramount and where tribal forms of living could be maintained at least partially. However, certain tribal customs, such as those which required the youth to prove his manhood by undergoing inhuman suffering or engaging in warfare or cattle stealing before he could marry or become a full-fledged member of the tribe, had to be curtailed. They were replaced in the 20th century by the custom of taking work in the mines of South Africa as contract laborers for a period of years. Such labor was as onerous and killing as tribal warfare had been earlier, because deaths from disease and accident were very high. But, by undergoing this test for about 5 years, the survivors obtained sufficient savings to allow them to return to their tribes and buy sufficient cattle and whites to support them as full members of the tribe for the rest of their days. Unfortunately, this procedure did not result in good agricultural practices, but rather in overgrazing, growing drought and erosion, and great population pressure in the native reserves. It also left the mines without any assured labor supply, so that it became necessary to recruit contract labor farther and farther north. Efforts by the Union government to set northern limits beyond which labor recruiting was forbidden led to controversy with employers, frequent changes in regulations, and widespread evasions. As a consequence of an agreement made by Milner with Portuguese authorities, about a quarter of the natives working in South African mines came from Portuguese East Africa even as late as 1936. As soon as South Africa was united in 1910, the kindergarten returned to London to try to federate the whole empire by the same methods. They were in a hurry to achieve this before the war with Germany, which they believed to be approaching. With aid daily money, they founded the Round Table under Curzlobian's editorship, met in formal conclaves presided over by Milner to decide the fate of the empire, and recruited new members to their group, chiefly from New College, of which Milner was a fellow. The new recruits included the historian F. F. Oliver, Sir Alfred Zimmern, Sir Reginald Coupland, Lord Lovat, and Waldorf Lord Astor. Curtis and others were sent around the world to organize round-table groups in the chief British dependencies. For several years 1910–1916 the Round Table groups worked desperately trying to find an acceptable formula for federating the empire. 3 books and many articles emerged from these discussions, but gradually it became clear that federation was not acceptable to the English-speaking dependencies. Gradually, it was decided to dissolve all formal bonds between these dependencies, except, perhaps, allegiance to the crown and depend on the common outlook of Englishmen to keep the empire together. This involved changing the name British Empire to Commonwealth of Nations, as in the title of Curtis's book of 1916, giving the chief dependencies, including India and Ireland, their complete independence but gradually, and by free gift rather than under duress, working to bring the United States more closely into this same orientation, and seeking to solidify the intangible links of sentiment by propaganda among financial, educational, and political leaders in each country. Efforts to bring the dependencies into a closer relationship with the mother country were by no means new in 1910, nor were they supported only by the Rhodes-Milner Group. Nevertheless, the actions of this group were all-pervasive. The poor military performance of British forces during the Boer War led to the creation of a commission to investigate the South African War, with Lord Esher Brett as chairman in 1903. Among other items, this commission recommended creation of a permanent committee of Imperial defense. Esher became unofficial chairman of this committee, holding the position for the rest of his life 1905 to 1930. He was able to establish an Imperial General Staff in 1907 and to get a complete reorganization of the military forces of New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa so that they could be incorporated into the Imperial forces in an emergency 1909–1912. On the committee itself he created an able secretariat which cooperated loyally with the Rhodes-Milner Group thereafter. These men included Sir Maurice later Lord Hankey and Sir Ernest Swinton, who invented the tank in 1915. When, in 1916–1917, Milner and Esher persuaded the cabinet to create a secretariat for the first time, the task was largely given to this secretariat from the Committee on Imperial Defense. Thus Hankey was secretary to the committee for 30 years 1908–1938 to the cabinet for 22 years 1916–1938 clerk to the Privy Council for 15 years 1923–1938 Secretary General of the 5 Imperial Conferences held between 1921 and 1937. Secretary to the British delegation to almost every important international conference, held between the Versailles Conference of 1919 and the Lausanne Conference of 1932, and one of the leading advisers to the conservative governments after 1939. Until 1907 the overseas portions of the empire except India communicated with the imperial government through the Secretary of State for Colonies. To supplement this relationship, conferences of the Prime Ministers of the self-governing colonies were held in London to discuss common problems in 1887, 1897, 1902, 1907, 1911, 1917, and 1918. In 1907 it was decided to hold such conferences every 4 years, to call the self-governing colonies dominions, and to bypass the colonial secretary by establishing the new Dominion Department. Ruskin's influence, among others, could be seen in the emphasis of the Imperial Conference of 191 that the empire rested on a triple foundation of 1 rule of law, 2 local autonomy, and 3 trusteeship of the interests and fortunes of those fellow subjects who had not yet attained self-government. The conference of 1915 could not be held because of the war, but as soon as Milner became one of the 4 members of the War Cabinet in 1915, his influence began to be felt everywhere. We have mentioned that he established a cabinet secretariat in 1917 consisting of 2 protégés of Esher Hancock and Swinton and 2 of his own secretaries, Leopold Amory and W. G. A. Ormsby Gort, later Lord Harlech. At the same time he gave the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, a secretariat from the Round Table, consisting of Curlodian Gribb, Lord Altrincham, W. G. S. Adams Fellow of All Souls College and Astor. He created an Imperial War Cabinet by adding Dominion Prime Ministers, particularly Smuts, to the United Kingdom War Cabinet. He also called the Imperial Conferences of 1917 and 1918 and invited the Dominions to establish resident ministers in London. The war drew to a close in 1918. Milner took the office of Colonial Secretary, with Amory as his assistant, negotiated an agreement providing independence for Egypt, set up a new self-government constitution in Malta, sent Curtis to India where he drew up the chief provisions of the Government of India Act of 1919, appointed Curtis to the post of advisor on Irish affairs, where he played an important role in granting Dominion status to Southern Ireland. In 1921 gave Canada permission to establish separate diplomatic relations with the United States, the first minister being the son-in-law of Milner's closest collaborator on the Rhodes Trust, and called the Imperial Conference of 1921. During this decade 1919 to 1929, the Rhodes-Milner Group gave the chief impetus toward transforming the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations and launching India on the road to responsible self-government. The creation of the Round Table groups by Milner's kindergarten in 1909 to 1913 opened a new day in both these fields, although the whole group was so secretive that, even today, many closed students of the subject are not aware of its significance. These men had formed their intellectual growth at Oxford on Pericles' funeral oration, as described in a book by a member of the group, Sir Alfred Swinburne's The Greek Commonwealth 1911, on Edmund Burke's On Conciliation with America, on Sir J.B.C. Lee's Growth of British Policy, on A.B. Diocese the Law and Custom of the Constitution, and on the New Testament's Sermon on the Mount. The last was especially influential on Lionel Curtis. He had a fanatical conviction that with the proper spirit and the proper organization, local self-government and federalism, the kingdom of God could be established on earth. He was sure that if people were trusted just a bit beyond what they deserve, they would respond by proving worthy of such trust. As he wrote in The Problem of a Commonwealth 1916, if political power is granted to groups before they are fit, they will tend to rise to the need. This was the spirit which Milner's group tried to use toward the Boers in 1902 to 1910, toward India in 1910-1947, and, unfortunately, toward Hitler in 1933 to 1939. This point of view was reflected in Curtis's 3 volumes on world history, published as a bit of DDI in 1938. In the case of Hitler, at least, these high ideals led to disaster. This seems also to be the case in South Africa. Whether this group succeeded in transforming the British Empire into a commonwealth of nations or merely succeeded in destroying the British Empire is not yet clear, but one seems as likely as the other. That these ideas were not solely those of Curtis but were held by the group as a whole will be clear to all who study it. When Lord Lothian died in Washington in 1940, Curtis published a volume of his speeches and included the obituary which Gregg had written for the Round Table. Of Lothian this said, he held that men should strive to build the kingdom of heaven here upon this earth, and that the leadership in that task must fall first and foremost upon the English-speaking peoples. Other attitudes of this influential group can be gathered from some quotations from 4 books published by Curtis in 1916 to 1920. The rule of law as contrasted with the rule of an individual is the distinguishing mark of the Commonwealth. In despotisms, government rests on the authority of the ruler or of the invisible and uncontrollable power behind him. In a commonwealth, rulers derive their authority from the law, and the law from a public opinion which is competent to change it. The idea that the principle of the Commonwealth implies universal suffrage betrays an ignorance of its real nature. That principle simply means that government rests on the duty of the citizens to each other, and is to be vested in those who are capable of setting public interests before their own. The task of preparing for freedom the races which cannot as yet govern themselves is the supreme duty of those who can. It is the spiritual end for which the Commonwealth exists, and material order is nothing except as a means to it. The peoples of India and Egypt, no less than those of the British Isles and Dominions, must be gradually schooled in the management of their national affairs. The whole effect of the War of 1914 to 1918 has been to bring movements long gathering to a sudden head. Companionship in arms has fanned long smoldering resentment against the presumption that Europeans are destined to dominate the rest of the world. In every part of Asia and Africa it is bursting into flames. Personally, I regard this challenge to the long unquestioned claim of the white man to dominate the world as inevitable and wholesome, especially to ourselves. The world is in the throes which precede creation or death. Our whole race has outgrown the merely national state, and, as surely as day follows night or night the day, will pass either to a commonwealth of nations or else to an empire of slaves. And the issue of these agonies rests with us. In this spirit the Rhodes-Milner Group tried to draw plans for a federation of the British Empire in 1909 to 1916. Gradually this project was replaced or postponed in favor of the Commonwealth project of free cooperation. Milner seems to have accepted the lesser aim after a meeting, sponsored by the Empire Parliamentary Association, on July 28, 1916. At which he outlined the project for federation with many references to the writings of Curtis, but found that not one Dominion member present would accept it. At the Imperial Conference of 1917, under his guidance, it was resolved that any readjustment of constitutional relations should be based on a full recognition of the dominions as autonomous nations of an imperial commonwealth and of India as an important portion of the same, should recognize the right of the dominions and India to an adequate voice in foreign policy and in foreign relations, and should provide effective arrangements for continuous consultation in all important matters of common imperial concern. Another resolution called for full representation for India in future imperial conferences. This was done in 1918. At this second wartime Imperial Conference it was resolved that Prime Ministers of Dominions could communicate directly with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and that each Dominion and India could establish resident ministers in London who would have seats on the Imperial War Cabinet. Milner was the chief motivating force in these developments. He hoped that the Imperial War Cabinet would continue to meet annually after the war, but this did not occur. During these years 1917 to 1918, the declaration was drawn up establishing complete independence for the dominions except for allegiance to the Crown. This was not issued until 1926. Instead, on July 9, 1919 Milner issued an official statement which said, "The United Kingdom and the Dominions are partner nations, not yet indeed of equal power, but for good and all of equal status. The only possibility of a continuance of the British Empire is on a basis of absolute out-and-out equal partnership between the United Kingdom and the Dominions. I say that without any kind of reservation whatsoever." This point of view was restated in the so-called Balfour Declaration of 1926 and was enacted into law as the Statute of Westminster in 1931. B.K. Long of the South African Round Table Group, who was colonial editor of the Times in 1913 to 1921 and editor of Rhodes's paper, The Cape Times, in South Africa in 1922 to 1935, tells us that the provisions of the Declaration of 1926 were agreed on in 1917 during the Imperial Conference convoked by Milner. They were formulated by John W. Dafoe, editor of the Winnipeg Free Press for 43 years and the most influential journalist in Canada for much of that period. Dafoe persuaded the Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, to accept his ideas and then brought in Long and Dawson, editor of the Times. Dawson negotiated the agreement with Milner, Smuts, and others. Although Australia and New Zealand were far from satisfied, the influence of Canada and of South Africa carried the agreement. 9 years later it was issued under Balfour's name at a conference convoked by Amory. In the dependent empire, especially in tropical Africa north of the Zambezi River, the Rhodes-Milner Group was unable to achieve most of its desires, but was able to win wide publicity for them, especially for its views on native questions. It dominated the colonial office in London, at least for the decade 1919 to 1929. There Milner was Secretary of State in 1919 to 1921 and Amory in 1924 to 1929, while the post of Parliamentary Under-Secretary was held by 3 members of the group for most of the decade. Publicity for their views on civilizing the natives and training them for eventual self-government received wide dissemination, not only by official sources but also by the academic, scholarly, and journalistic organizations they dominated. As examples of this we might mention the writings of Coupland, Haley, Curtis, Grigg, Amory, and Lothian, all round tabulars. In 1938 Lord Haley edited a gigantic volume of 1,837 pages called An Africa Survey. This work was first suggested by Smuts at Rhodes House, Oxford, in 1929, had a foreword by Lothian, and an editorial board of Lothian, Haley, Coupland, Curtis, and others. It remains the greatest single book on modern Africa. These people, and others, through the Times, the Round Table, the Observer, Chatham House, and other conduits, became the chief source of ideas on colonial problems in the English-speaking world. Nevertheless, they were unable to achieve their program. In the course of the 1920s the Round Table program for East Africa was paralyzed by a debate on the priority which should be given to the 3 aspects of group's project for a Negro dominion north of the Zambezi. The 3 parts were 1. Native rights, 2. Closer union, and 3. International trusteeship. Generally, the group gave priority to closer union federation of Kenya with Uganda and Tanganyika, but the ambiguity of their ideas on native rights made it possible for Dr. Joseph H. Oldham, spokesman for the organized nonconformist missionary groups, to organize a successful opposition movement to Federation of East Africa. In this effort Oldham found a powerful ally in Lord Lugard, and considerable support from other informed persons, including Marjorie Perham. The Round Tabulars, who had no first-hand knowledge of native life or even of tropical Africa, were devoted supporters of the English way of life, and could see no greater benefit conferred on natives than to help them to move in that direction. This, however, would inevitably destroy the tribal organization of life, as well as the native systems of land tenure, which were generally based on tribal holding of land. The white settlers were eager to see these things disappear, since they generally wished to bring the native labor force and African lands into the commercial market. Oldham and Lugard opposed this, since they felt it would lead to white ownership of large tracts of land on which detribalized and demoralized natives would subsist as wage slaves. Moreover, to Lugard, economy in colonial administration required that natives be governed under his system of indirect rule through tribal chiefs. Closer union became a controversial target in this dispute because it involved a gradual increase in local self-government which would lead to a greater degree of white settler rule. The opposition to closer union in East Africa was successful in holding up this project in spite of the Round Table domination of the colonial office, chiefly because of Prime Minister Baldwin's refusal to move quickly. This delayed change until the Labour government took over in 1929. In this the pro-native, nonconformist especially Quaker influence was stronger. The trusteeship issue came into this controversy because Britain was bound, as a mandate power, to maintain native rights in Tanganyika to the satisfaction of the Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. This placed a major obstacle in the path of Round Table efforts to join Tanganyika with Kenya and Uganda into a Negro Dominion which would be under quite a different kind of trusteeship of the African colonial powers. Farther south, in the Rhodesias and Nyasaland, the Round Table obsession with federation did not meet this obstacle, and that area was eventually federated, over native protests, in 1953. But this creation, the Central African Federation, broke up again in 1964. Strangely enough, the League of Nations mandate system which became such an obstacle to the Round Table plans was largely a creation of the Round Table itself. The Milner Group used the defeat of Germany in 1918 as an opportunity to impose an international obligation on certain powers to treat the natives fairly in the regions taken from Germany. This opportunity was of great significance because just at that time the earlier impetus in this direction arising from missionaries was beginning to weaken as a consequence of the general weakening of religious feeling in European culture. The chief problem in East Africa arose from the position of the white settlers of Kenya. Although this colony rests directly on the equator, its interior islands, 4,000 to 10,000 feet up, were well adapted to white settlement and to European agricultural methods. The situation was dangerous by 1920, and grew steadily worse as the years passed, until by 1950 Kenya had the most critical native problem in Africa. It differed from South Africa in that it lacked self-government, rich mines, or a divided white population, but it had many common problems, such as overcrowded native reserves, soil erosion, and discontented and detribalized blacks working for low wages on lands owned by whites. It had about 2 million blacks and only 3,000 whites in 1910. 40 years later it had about 4 million blacks, 100,000 Indians, 24,000 Arabs, and only 30,000 whites, of which 40% were government employees. But what the whites lacked in numbers they made up in determination. The healthful islands were reserved for white ownership as early as 1908, although they were not delimited and guaranteed until 1939. They were organized as very large, mostly undeveloped farms, of which there were only 2,000 covering 10,000 square miles in 1940. Many of these farms were of more than 30,000 acres and had been obtained from the government, either by purchase or on very long 999-year leases for only nominal costs, rents about 2 cents per year per acre. The native reserves amounted to about 50,000 square miles of generally poorer land, or 5 times as much land for the blacks, although they had at least 150 times as many people. The Indians, chiefly in commerce and crafts, were so industrious that they gradually came to own most of the commercial areas both in the towns and in the native reserves. The two great subjects of controversy in Kenya were concerned with the supply of labor and the problem of self-government, although less agitated problems, like agricultural technology, sanitation, and education, were of vital significance. The whites tried to increase the pressure on natives to work on white farms rather than to seek to make a living on their own lands within the reserves, by forcing them to pay taxes in cash, by curtailing the size or quality of the reserves, by restricting improvements in native agricultural techniques, and by personal and political pressure and compulsion. The effort to use political compulsion reached a peak in 1919 and was stopped by Milner, although his group, like Rhodes in South Africa, was eager to make natives more industrious and more ambitious by any kinds of social, educational, or economic pressures. The settlers encouraged natives to live off the reserves in various ways. For example, permitting them to settle as squatters on white estates in return for at least 180 claims of work a year at the usual low wage rates. To help both black and white farmers, not only in Kenya but throughout the world, Milner created, as a research organization, an Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture at Trinidad in 1919. As a consequence of various pressures which we have mentioned, notably the need to pay taxes which averaged, perhaps, 1 month's wages a year and, in the aggregate, took from the natives a larger sum than that realized from the sale of native products, the percentage of adult males working off the reservations increased from about 35% in 1925 to over 80% in 1940. This had very deleterious effects on tribal life, family life, native morality, and family discipline, although it seems to have had beneficial effects on native health and general education. The real crux of controversy before the Mau Mau uprising of 1948 to 1955 was the problem of self-government. Pointing to South Africa, the settlers in Kenya demanded self-rule which would allow them to enforce restrictions on non-whites. The local colonial government was organized under the Colonial Office in 1906. As was usual in such cases, it consisted of an appointed governor assisted by an appointed executive council and advised by a legislative council. The latter had, also as usual, the majority of officials and a minority of unofficial outsiders. Only in 1922 did the unofficial portion become elective, and only in 1949 did it become a majority of the whole body. The efforts to establish an elective element in the Legislative Council in 1919 to 1923 resulted in violent controversy. The draft drawn by the Council itself provided for only European members elected by a European electorate. Milner added to Indian members elected by a separate Indian electorate. In the resulting controversy, the settlers sought to obtain their original plan, while London sought the single electoral roll restricted in size by educational and property qualifications but without mention of race. To resist this, the settlers organized the Vigilance Committee and planned to seize the colony, abduct the governor, and form a republic federated in some way with South Africa. From this controversy came eventually a compromise, the famous Carroll White Paper of 1923, and the appointment of Sir Edward Grigg as governor for the period of 1925 to 1931. The compromise gave Kenya a legislative council containing representatives of the Imperial government, the white settlers, the Indians, the Arabs, and a white missionary to represent the blacks. Except for the settlers and Indians, most of these were nominated rather than elected. But by 1949, as the membership was enlarged, election was extended, and only the official and Negro members 4 out of 41 were nominated. The Kenya White Paper of 1923 arose from a specific problem in a single colony, but remained the formal statement of imperial policy in tropical Africa. It said, primarily Kenya is an African territory, and His Majesty's government think it necessary definitely to record their considered opinion that the interests of the African natives must be paramount, and that if and when those interests and the interests of the immigrant races should conflict, the former should prevail. In the administration of Kenya, His Majesty's government regard themselves as exercising the trust on behalf of the African population, and they are unable to delegate or share this trust, the object of which may be defined as the protection and advancement of the native races. As a result of these troubles in Kenya and the continued encroachment of white settlers on native reserves, Amory sent one of the most important members of Milner's group to the colony as governor and commander-in-chief. This was Sir Edward Grigg, Lord Altrincham, who had been a member of Milner's kindergarten, an editor of the Round Table and of the Times 1903 to 1905, 1908 to 1913, a secretary to Lloyd George and to the Rhodes Trustees 1923 to 1925, and a prolific writer on British imperial, colonial, and foreign affairs. In Kenya he tried to protect native reserves while still forcing natives to develop habits of industry by steady work, to shift white attention from political to technical problems such as agriculture, and to work toward a consolidation of tropical Africa into a single territorial unit. He forced through the colonial legislature in 1930 the Native Land Trust Ordinance, which guaranteed native reserves. But these reserves remained inadequate and were increasingly damaged by bad agricultural practices. Only in 1925 did any sustained effort to improve such practices by natives begin. About the same time efforts were made to extend the use of native courts, native advisory councils, and to train natives for an administrative service. All of these met slow, varied, and on the whole indifferent success, chiefly because of natives' reluctance to cooperate and the natives' growing suspicion of white men's motives even when these whites were most eager to help. The chief cause of this growing suspicion, which in some cases reached the psychotic level, would seem to be the natives' insatiable hunger for religion and his conviction that the whites were hypocrites who taught a religion that they did not obey, were traitors to Christ's teachings, and were using these to control the natives and to betray their interests, under cover of religious ideas which the whites themselves did not observe in practice. In the decade 1910 to 1920, the two greatest problems to be faced in creating a commonwealth of nations were India and Ireland. There can be no doubt that India provided a puzzle infinitely more complex, as it was more remote and less clearly envisioned, than Ireland. When the British East India Company became the dominant power in India about the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was in the last stages of disintegration. Provincial rulers had only nominal titles, sufficient to bring them immense treasure in taxes and rents, but they generally lacked either the will or the strength to maintain order. The more vigorous tried to expand their domains at the expense of the more feeble, oppressing the peace-loving peasantry in the process, while all legal power was challenged by roaming upstart bands and plundering tribes. Of these willful tribes, the most important were the Marathas. These systematically devastated much of south-central India in the last half of the 18th century, forcing each village to buy temporary immunity from destruction, but steadily reducing the capacity of the countryside to meet their demands because of the trail of death and economic disorganization they left in their wake. By 1900 only 1/5 of the land in some areas was cultivated. Although the East India Company was a commercial firm, primarily interested in profits, and thus reluctant to assume a political role in this chaotic countryside, it had to intervene again and again to restore order, replacing one nominal ruler by another and even taking over the government of those areas where it was more immediately concerned. In addition, the cupidity of many of its employees led them to intervene as political powers in order to divert to their own pockets some of the fabulous wealth which they saw flowing by. For these two reasons the areas under company rule, although not contiguous, expanded steadily until by 1858 they covered 3/5 of the country. Outside the British areas were over 500 princely domains, some no larger than a single village but others as extensive as some states of Europe. At this point, in 1857 to 1858, a sudden, violent insurrection of native forces, known as the Great Mutiny, resulted in the end of the Mughal Empire and of the East India Company, the British government taking over their political activities. From this flowed a number of important consequences. Annexation of native principalities ceased, leaving 562 outside British India, but under British protection and subject to British intervention to ensure good government. Within British India itself, good government became increasingly dominant and commercial profit decreasingly so for the whole period 1858 to 1947. British political prestige rose to new heights from 1858 to 1890 and then began to dwindle, failing precipitously in 1919 to 1922. The task of good government in India was not an easy one. In this great subcontinent with a population amounting to almost one-fifth of the human race were to be found an almost unbelievable diversity of cultures, religions, languages, and attitudes. Even in 1950 modern locomotives linked together great cities with advanced industrial production by passing through jungles inhabited by tigers, elephants, and primitive pagan tribes. The population, which increased from 284 million in 1901 to 389 million in 1941 and reached 530 million in 1961, spoke more than a dozen major languages divided into hundreds of dialects, and were members of dozens of antithetical religious beliefs. There were, in 1941, 255 million Hindus, 92 million Muslims, 6.3 million Christians, 5.7 million Sikhs, 1.5 million Jains, and almost 26 million pagan animists of various kinds. In addition, the Hindus and even some of the non-Hindus were divided into four major hereditary castes subdivided into thousands of subcastes, plus the lowest group of outcasts and untouchables amounting to at least 30 million persons in 1900 and twice this number in 1950. These thousands of groups were endogamous, practiced hereditary economic activities, frequently had distinctive marks or guard, and were usually forbidden to marry, eat or drink with, or even to associate with, persons of different caste. Untouchables were generally forbidden to come in contact, even indirectly, with members of other groups and were, accordingly, forbidden to enter many temples or public buildings, to draw water from the public wells, even to allow their shadows to fall on any person of a different group, and were subject to other restrictions, all designed to avoid a personal pollution which could be removed only by religious rituals of varying degrees of elaborateness. Most subcastes were occupational groups covering all kinds of activities, so that there were hereditary groups of carry-on collectors, thieves, highway robbers, or murderers, thugs as well as farmers, fishermen, storekeepers, drug mixers, or copper smelters. For most peoples of India, caste was the most important fact of life, submerging their individuality into a group from which they could never escape, and regulating all their activities from birth to death. As a result, India, even as late as 1900, was a society in which status was dominant, each individual having a place in a group which, in turn, had a place in society. This place, known to all and accepted by all, operated by established procedures in its relationships with other groups so that there was, in spite of diversity, a minimum of intergroup friction and a certain peaceful tolerance so long as intergroup etiquette was known and accepted. The diversity of social groups and beliefs was naturally reflected in an extraordinarily wide range of social behavior, from the most degraded and bestial activities based on crude superstitions to even more astounding levels of exalted spiritual self-sacrifice and cooperation. Although the British refrained from interfering with religious practices, in the course of the 19th century they abolished or greatly reduced the practice of Thugism, in which a secret caste strangled strangers in honor of the goddess Kali Sati, in which the widow of a deceased Hindu was expected to destroy herself on his funeral pyre, infanticide, temple prostitution, and child marriages. At the other extreme, most Hindus abstained from all violence. Many had such a respect for life that they would eat no meat, not even eggs, while a few carried this belief so far that they would not molest a cobra about to strike, the mosquito about to sting, or even walk about at night, lest they unknowingly step on an ant or worm. Hindus, who considered cows so sacred that the worst crime would be to cause the death of one even by accident, who allowed millions of these beasts to have free run of the country to the great detriment of cleanliness or standards of living, who would not wear shoes of leather, and would rather die than taste beef, ate pork and associated daily with Muslims who ate beef but considered pigs to be polluting. In general, most Indians lived in abject poverty and want. Only about 1 in 100 could read in 1858, while considerably less could understand the English language. The overwhelming majority at that time were peasants, pressed down by onerous taxes and rents, isolated in small villages unconnected by roads, and decimated at irregular intervals by famine or disease. British rule in the period 1858 to 1947 tied India together by railroads, roads, and telegraph lines. It brought the country into contact with the Western world, and especially with world markets, by establishing the uniform system of money, steamboat connections with Europe by the Suez Canal, cable connections throughout the world, and the use of English as the language of government and administration. Best of all, Britain established the rule of law, equality before the law, and a tradition of judicial fairness to replace the older practice of inequality and arbitrary violence. A certain degree of efficiency, and a certain ambitious, if discontented, energy directed toward change replaced the older abject resignation to inevitable fate. The modern postal, telegraphic, and railroad systems all began in 1854. The first grew to such dimensions that by the outbreak of war in 1939 it handled over 1 billion pieces of mail and 40 million rupees in money orders each year. The railroad grew from 2 miles in 1855 to 9,000 in 1880, to 25,000 in 1901. And to 43,000 in 1939. This, the third largest railroad system in the world, carried 600 million passengers and a million tons of freight a year. About the same time, the dirt tracks of 1858 had been partly replaced by over 300,000 miles of highways, of which only about a quarter could be rated as first class. From 1925 onward, these highways were used increasingly by passenger buses, crowded and ramshackle in many cases, but steadily breaking down the isolation of the villages. Improved communications and public order served to merge the isolated village markets, smoothing out the earlier alternations of scarcity and glut with their accompanying phenomena of waste and of starvation in the midst of plenty. All this led to a great extension of cultivation into more remote areas and the growing of a greater variety of crops. Sparsely settled areas of forests and hills, especially in Assam and the northwest provinces, were occupied, without the devastation of deforestation as in China or in non-Indian Nepal because of a highly developed forestry conservation service. Migration, permanent and seasonal, became regular features of Indian life, the earnings of the migrants being sent back to their families in the villages they had left. A magnificent system of canals, chiefly for irrigation, was constructed, populating desolate wastes, especially in the northwestern parts of the country, and encouraging whole tribes which had previously been pastoral freebooters to settle down as cultivators. By 1939 almost 60 million acres of land were irrigated. For this and other reasons, the sown area of India increased from 195 to 228 million acres in about 40 years 1900 to 1939. Increases in yields were much less satisfactory because of reluctance to change, lack of knowledge or capital, and organizational problems. The tax on land traditionally had been the major part of public revenue in India, and remained near so percent as late as 1900. Under the Mughals these land revenues had been collected by tax farmers. In many areas, notably Bengal, the British tended to regard these land revenues as rents rather than taxes, and thus regarded the revenue collectors as the owners of the land. Once this was established, these new landlords used their powers to raise rents, to evict cultivators who had been on the same land for years or even generations, and to create an unstable rural proletariat of tenants and laborers unable or unwilling to improve their methods. Numerous legislative enactments sought, without great success, to improve these conditions. Such efforts were counterbalanced by the growth of population, the great rise in the value of land, the inability of industry or commerce to drain surplus population from the land as fast as it increased, the tendency of the government to favor industry or commerce over agriculture by tariffs, taxation, and public expenditures, the growing frequency of famines from droughts, of malaria from irrigation projects, and of plague from trade with the Far East, which wiped out in 1 year gains made in several years, the growing burden of peasant debt at onerous terms and at high interest rates, and the growing inability to supplement incomes from cultivation by incomes from household crafts because of the growing competition from cheap industrial goods. Although slavery was abolished in 1843, many of the poor were reduced to peonage by contracting debts at unfair terms and binding themselves and their heirs to work for their creditors until the debt was paid. Such a debt could never be paid, in many cases, because the rate at which it was reduced was left to the creditor and could rarely be questioned by the illiterate debtor. All of these misfortunes culminated in the period 1895 to 1901. There had been a long period of declining prices in 1873 to 1896. Which increased the burden on debtors and stagnated economic activities. In 1897 a monsoon rains failed, with a loss of 18 million tons of food crops and of 1 million lives from famine. This disaster was repeated in 1899 to 1900. Bubonic plague was introduced to Bombay from China in 1895 and killed about 2 million persons in the next 6 years. From this low point in 1901, economic conditions improved fairly steadily, except for a brief period in 1919 to 1922 and the long burden of the World Depression in 1929 to 1934. The rise in prices in 1914 benefited India more than others, as the prices of her exports rose more rapidly. The War of 1914 to 1918 gave India a great economic opportunity, especially by increasing the demand for her textiles. Tariffs were raised steadily after 1916, providing protection for industry, especially in metals, textiles, cement, and paper. The customs became the largest single source of revenue, alleviating to some extent the pressure of taxation on cultivators. However, the agrarian problem remained acute, for most of the factors listed above remained in force. In 1931 it was estimated that, in the United Provinces, 30% of the cultivators could not make a dotting from their holdings even in good years, while 52% could make a living in good years but not in bad ones. There was great economic advance in mining, industry, commerce, and finance in the period after 1900. Coal output went up from 6 to 21 million tons in 1900 to 1924, and petroleum output chiefly from Burma went up from 37 to 294 million gallons. Production in the protected industries also improved in the same period until, by 1932, India could produce 3/4 of her cotton cloth, 3/4 of her steel, and most of her cement, matches, and sugar. In one product, jute, India became the chief source for the world's supply, and this became the leading export after 1925. A notable feature of the growth of manufacturing in India after 1900 lies in the fact that Hindu capital largely replaced British capital, chiefly for political reasons. In spite of India's poverty, there was a considerable volume of saving, arising chiefly from the inequitable distribution of income to the landlord class and to the money lenders, if these two groups can be separated in this way. Naturally, these groups preferred to invest their incomes back in the activities whence they had been derived, but, after 1919, nationalist agitation and especially Gandhi's influence inclined many Hindus to make contributions to their country's strength by investing in industry. The growth of industry should not be exaggerated, and its influences were considerably less than one might believe at first glance. There was little growth of an urban proletariat or of a permanent class of factory workers, although this did exist. Increases in output came largely from power production rather than from increases in the labor force. This labor force continued to be rural in its psychological and social orientation, being generally temporary migrants from the villages, living under urban industrial conditions only for a few years, with every intention of returning to the village eventually, and generally sending savings back to their families and visiting them 4 weeks or even months each year, generally at the harvest season. This class of industrial laborers did not adopt either an urban or proletarian point of view, were almost wholly illiterate, formed labor organizations only reluctantly because of refusal to pay dues, and rarely acquired industrial skills. After 1915, labor unions did appear, but membership remained small, and they were organized and controlled by non-laboring persons, frequently middle-class intellectuals. Moreover, industry remained a widely scattered activity found in a few cities but absent from the rest. Although India had 35 cities of over 100,000 population in 1901, most of these remained commercial and administrative centers and not manufacturing centers. That the chief emphasis remained on rural activities can be seen from the fact that these 35 centers of population had a total of 8.2 million inhabitants compared to 310.7 million outside their limits in 1921. In fact, only 30 million persons lived in the 1,623 centers of over 5,000 persons each, while 289 million lived in centers smaller than 5,000 persons. One of the chief ways in which the impact of Western culture reached India was by education. The charge has frequently been made that the British neglected education in India, or that they made an error in emphasizing education in English for the upper classes rather than education in the vernacular languages for the masses of the people. History does not sustain the justice of these charges. In England itself the government assumed little responsibility for education until 1902, and in general had a more advanced policy in this field in India than in England until well into the present century. Until 1835 the English did try to encourage native traditions of education, but their vernacular schools failed from lack of patronage. The Indians themselves objected to being excluded, as they regarded it, from English education. Accordingly, from 1835 the British offered English language education on the higher levels in the hope that Western science, technology, and political attitudes could be introduced without disrupting religious or social life, and that these innovations would infiltrate downward into the population. Because of the expense, government-sponsored education had to be restricted to the higher levels, although encouragement for vernacular schools on the lower levels began without much financial obligation in 1854. The infiltration downward theory was quite mistaken, because those who acquired knowledge of English used it as a passport to advancement in government service or professional life and became renegades from, rather than missionaries to, the lower classes of Indian society. In a sense, the use of English on the university level of education did not lead to its spread in Indian society, but removed those who acquired it from that society, leaving them in the kind of barren ground which was neither Indian nor Western, but hovered uncomfortably between the two. The fact that knowledge of English and possession of a university degree could free one from the physical drudgery of Indian life by opening the door to public service or the professions created a veritable passion to obtain these keys, but only in a minority. The British had little choice but to use English as the language of government and higher education. In India, the languages used in these two fields had been foreign ones for centuries. The language of government and of the courts was Persian until 1837. Advanced and middle-level education had always been foreign, in Sanskrit for the Hindus and in Arabic for the Muslims. Sanskrit, a dead language, was that of Hindu religious literature, while Arabic was the language of the Quran, the only writing the ordinary Muslim would wish to read. In fact, the allegiance of the Muslims to the Quran and to Arabic was so intense that they refused to participate in the new English language educational system and, in consequence, had been excluded from government, the professions, and much of the economic life of the country by 1900. No vernacular language could have been used to teach our really valuable contributions of the West, such as science, technology, economics, agricultural science, or political science, because the necessary vocabulary was lacking in the vernaculars. When the University of the native state of Hyderabad tried to translate Western works into Urdu for teaching purposes after 1920, it was necessary to create about 40,000 new words. Moreover, the large number of vernacular languages would have made the choice of any one of them for the purpose of higher education invidious. And, finally, the natives themselves had no desire to learn to read their vernacular languages, at least during the 19th century. They wanted to learn English because it provided access to knowledge, to government positions, and to social advancement as no vernacular could. But it must be remembered that it was the exceptional Indian, not the average one, who wanted to learn to read at all. The average native was content to remain illiterate, at least until deep into the 20th century. Only then did the desire to read spread under the stimulus of growing nationalism, political awareness, and growing concern with political and religious tensions. These fostered the desire to read, in order to read newspapers, but this had adverse effects. Each political or religious group had its own press and presented its own biased version of world events, so that, by 1940, these different groups had entirely different ideas of reality. Moreover, the new enthusiasm for the vernacular languages, the influence of extreme Hindu nationalists like B.G. Tilak (1859–1920) or anti-Westerners like M. K. Gandhi (1869–1948) led to a wholesale rejection of all that was best in British or in European culture. At the same time, those who sought power, advancement, or knowledge continued to learn English is the key to these ambitions. Unfortunately, these semi-westernized Indians neglected much of the practical side of the European way of life and tended to be intellectualist and doctrinaire and to despise practical learning and physical labor. They lived, as we have said, in a middle world which was neither Indian nor Western, spoiled for the Indian way of life, but often unable to find a position in Indian society which would allow them to live their own version of the Western way of life. At the university they studied literature, law, and political science, all subjects which emphasize verbal accomplishments. Since India did not provide sufficient jobs for such accomplishments, there was a great deal of academic unemployment, with resulting discontent and growing radicalism. The career of Gandhi was the result of the efforts of one man to avoid this problem by fusing certain elements of Western teaching with a purified Hinduism to create a nationalist Indian way of life on a basically moral foundation. It is obvious that one of the chief effects of British educational policy has been to increase the social tensions within India and to give them a political orientation. This change is usually called the rise of Indian nationalism, but it is considerably more complex than this simple name might imply. It began to rise about 1890, possibly under the influence of the misfortunes at the end of the century, grew steadily until it reached the crisis stage after 1917, and finally emerged in the long-drawn crisis of 1930 to 1947. India's outlook was fundamentally religious, just as the British outlook was fundamentally political. The average Indian derived from his religious outlook a profound conviction that the material world and physical comfort were irrelevant and unimportant in contrast with such spiritual matters as the proper preparation for the life to come after the body's death. From his English education the average Indian student derived the conviction that liberty and self-government were the highest goods of life and must be sought by such resistance to authority as had been shown in the Magna Carta, the opposition to Charles I, the Glorious Revolution of 1689, the writings of John Locke and of John Stuart Mill, and the general resistance to public authority found in 19th-century liberalism and laissez-faire. These two points of view tended to merge in the minds of Indian intellectuals into a point of view in which it seemed that English political ideals should be sought by Indian methods of religious fervour, self-sacrifice, and contempt for material welfare or physical comforts. As a result, political and social tensions were exacerbated between British and Indians, between Westernizers and nationalists, between Hindus and Muslims, between Brahmins and lower castes, and between caste members and outcasts. In the early part of the 19th century there had been a revival of interest in Indian languages and literatures. This revival soon revealed that many Hindu ideas and practices had no real support in the earliest evidence, since these later innovations included some of the most objectionable features of Hindu life, such as sati, child marriage, female inferiority, image worship, and extreme polytheism. The movement began that sought to free Hinduism from these extraneous elements and to restore it to its earlier purity by emphasizing ethics, monotheism, and an abstract idea of deity. This tendency was reinforced by the influence of Christianity and of Islam, so that the revived Hinduism was really a synthesis of these three religions. As a consequence of these influences, the old, and basic, Hindu idea of karma was played down. This idea maintained that each individual soul reappeared again and again, throughout eternity, in a different physical form and in a different social status, each difference being the reward or punishment for the soul's conduct at its previous appearance. There was no real hope for escape from this cycle, except by a gradual improvement through a long series of successive appearances to the ultimate goal of complete obliteration of personality nirvana by ultimate emergence in the soul of the universe Brahma. This release moksha from the endless cycle of existence could be achieved only by the suppression of all desire, of all individuality, and of all will to live. The belief in karma was the key to Hindu ideology and to Hindu society, explaining not only the emphasis on fate and resignation to fate, the idea that man was a part of nature and brother to the beasts, the submergence of individuality and the lack of personal ambition, but also specific social institutions such as caste or even sati. How could castes be ended if these are God-given gradations for the rewards or punishments earned in an earlier existence? How could sati be ended if a wife is a wife through all eternity, and must pass from one life to another when her husband does? The influence of Christianity and of Islam, of Western ideas and of British education, in changing Hindu society was largely a consequence of their ability to reduce the average Hindu's faith in karma. One of the earliest figures in this growing synthesis of Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam was Ram Mohan Roy (1772–1833), founder of the Brahmo Samaj Society in 1828. Another was Keshab Chandra Sen (1841–1884), who hoped to unite Asia and Europe into a common culture on the basis of a synthesis of the common elements of these three religions. There were many reformers of this type. Their most notable feature was that they were universalist rather than nationalist and were westernizers in their basic inclinations. About 1870 a change began to appear, perhaps from the influence of Ramakrishna (1834–1886) and his disciple Swami Vivekananda (1862–1902), founder of Vedanta. This new tendency emphasized India's spiritual power as a higher value than the material power of the West. It advocated simplicity, asceticism, self-sacrifice, cooperation, and India's mission to spread these virtues to the world. One of the disciples of this movement was Gopal Krishna Gokhale, 1866–1915, founder of the Servants of India Society 1905. This was a small band of devoted persons who took vows of poverty and obedience, to regard all Indians as brothers irrespective of caste or creed, and to engage in no personal quarrels. The members scattered among the most diverse groups of India to teach, to weld India into a single spiritual unit, and to seek social reform. In time these movements became increasingly nationalistic and anti-Western, tending to defend orthodox Hinduism rather than to purify it, and to oppose Westerners rather than to copy them. This tendency culminated in Bal Gangadhar Tilak, 1859–1920, the Marathi journalist of Pune, who started his career in mathematics and law but slowly developed a passionate love for Hinduism, even in its most degrading details, and insisted that it must be defended against outsiders, even with violence. He was not opposed to reforms which appeared as spontaneous developments of Indian sentiment, but he was violently opposed to any attempt to legislate reform from above or to bring in foreign influences from European or Christian sources. He first became a political figure in 1891 when he vigorously opposed a government bill which would have curtailed child marriage by fixing the age of consent for girls at 12 years. By 1897 he was using his paper to incite to murder and riot against government officials. The British official W. Ho foresaw this movement toward violent nationalism as early as 1878, sought to divert it into more legal and more constructive channels by establishing the Indian National Congress in 1885. The official in question, Alan Octavian Hume, 1829–1912, had the secret support of the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin. They hoped to assemble each year an unofficial Congress of Indian leaders to discuss Indian political matters in the hope that this experience would provide training in the working of representative institutions and parliamentary government. For 20 years the Congress agitated for extension of Indian participation in the administration, and for the extension of representation and eventually of parliamentary government within the British system. It is notable that this movement renounced violent methods, did not seek separation from Britain, and aspired to form a government based on the British pattern. Support for the movement grew very slowly at first, even among Hindus, and there was open opposition, led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, among the Muslims. As the movement gathered momentum, after 1890, many British officials began to oppose it. At the same time, under pressure from Tilak, the Congress itself advanced its demands and began to use economic pressure to obtain these. As a result, after 1900, fewer Muslims joined the Congress. There were 156 Muslims out of 702 delegates in 1890, but only 17 out of 756 in 1905. All these forces came to a head in 1904 to 1907 when the Congress, for the first time, demanded self-government within the Empire for India and approved the use of economic pressures boycott against Britain. The Japanese victory over Russia in 1905, which was regarded as an Asiatic triumph over Europe, the Russian revolt of 1905, the growing power of Tilak over Gokhale in the Indian National Congress, and public agitation over Lord Curzon's efforts to push through an administrative division of the huge province of Bengal, population 78 million, brought matters to a head. There was open agitation by Hindu extremists to spill English blood to satisfy the goddess of destruction, Kali. In the Indian National Congress of 1907, the followers of Tilak stormed the platform and disrupted the meeting. Much impressed with the revolutionary violence in Russia against the Tsar and in Ireland against the English, this group advocated the use of terrorism rather than of petitions in India. The Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, was wounded by a bomb in 1912. For many years, racial intolerance against Indians by English residents in India had been growing, and was increasingly manifested in studied insults and even physical assaults. In 1906 a Muslim League was formed in opposition to tiled Hindu extremists and in support of the British position, but in 1913 it also demanded self-government. Tilak's group boycotted the Indian National Congress for 9 years, 1907 to 1916, and Tilak himself was in prison for sedition for 6 years, 1908 to 1914. The constitutional development of India did not stand still during this tumult. In 1861 appointive councils with advisory powers had been created, both as the centre to assist the viceroy and in the provinces. These had non-official as well as official members, and the provincial ones had certain legislative powers. But all these activities were under strict executive control and veto. In 1892 these powers were widened to allow discussion of administrative questions, and various non-governmental groups called communities were allowed to suggest individuals for the unofficial seats in the councils. The Third Act of 1909, passed by the Liberal government with John Lord Morley as Secretary of State and Lord Minto as Viceroy, enlarged the councils, making a non-official majority in the provincial councils, allowed the councils to vote on all issues, and gave the right to elect the non-official members to various communal groups, including Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, on a fixed ratio. This last provision was a disaster. By establishing separate electoral lists for various religious groups, it encouraged religious extremism in all groups, made it likely that the more extremist candidates would be successful, and made religious differences a basic and irreconcilable fact of political life. By giving religious minorities more seats than their actual proportions of the electorate entitled them to a principle known as weightage, it made it politically advantageous to a minority. by emphasizing minority rights in which they did believe over majority rule in which they did not believe. The British made religion a permanently disruptive force in political life, and encouraged the resulting exacerbated extremism to work out its rivalries outside the constitutional framework and the scope of legal action. In riots rather than at the polls or in political assemblies. Moreover, as soon as the British had given the Muslims this special constitutional position in 1909, they lost the support of the Muslim community in 1911 to 1919. This loss of Muslim support was the result of several factors. Curzon's division of Bengal, which the Muslims had supported since it gave them East Bengal as a separate area with a Muslim majority, was countermanded in 1911 without any notice to the Muslims. British foreign policy after 1911 was increasingly anti-Turkish, and thus opposed to the Caliph, the religious leader of the Muslims. As a result, the Muslim League called for self-government for India for the first time in 1913, and 4 years later formed an alliance with the Indian National Congress, which continued until 1924. In 1909, while Philip Curlodian, Lionel Curtis, and Sir William Maris were in Canada laying the foundations for the Round Table organization there, Maris persuaded Curtis that self-government, however far distant, was the only intelligible goal of British policy in India. The existence of political unrest in India, so far from being a reason for pessimism, was the surest sign that the British, with all their manifest failings, had not shirked their primary duty of extending Western education to India and so preparing Indians to govern themselves. 4 years later, the Round Table Group in London decided to investigate how this could be done. It formed a study group of 8 members, under Curtis, adding to the group 3 officials from the India office. This group decided, in 1915, to issue a public declaration favoring the progressive realization of responsible government in India. The declaration to this effect was drawn up by Lord Milner and was issued on August 20, 1917, by Secretary of State for India Edwin S. Montagu. It said that the policy of His Majesty's government, with which the Government of India are in complete accord, is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration and the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. This declaration was revolutionary because, for the first time, it specifically enunciated British hopes for India's future, and because it used, for the first time, the words responsible government. The British had spoken vaguely for over a century about self-government for India. They had spoken increasingly about representative government, but they had consistently avoided the expression responsible government. This latter term meant parliamentary government, which most English conservatives regarded as quite unsuited for Indian conditions, since it required, they believed, an educated electorate and homogeneous social system, both of which were lacking in India. The Conservatives had talked for years about ultimate self-government for India on some indigenous Indian model, but had done nothing to find such a model. Then, without any clear conception of where they were going, they had introduced representative government, in which the executive consulted with public opinion through representatives of the people either appointed, as in 1871, or elected, as in 1909, but with the executive still autocratic and in no way responsible to these representatives. The use of the expression responsible government in the Declaration of 1917 went back to the Round Table Group and ultimately to the Maris-Curtis conversation in the Canadian Rockies in 1909. In the meantime, the Round Table Study Group had worked for 3 years 1916 on methods for carrying out this promise. Through the influence of Curtis and F. F. Oliver, the Federal Constitution of the United States contributed a good deal to the drafts which were made, especially to provisions for dividing governmental activities into central and provincial portions, with gradual Indianization of the latter and 166 ultimately of the former. This approach to the problem was named hierarchy by Curtis. The Round Table draft was sent to the Governor of New South Wales, Lord Chelmsford, a Fellow of All Souls College, who believed that it came from an official committee of the India Office. After he accepted it in principle, he was made Viceroy of India in 1916. Curtis went to India immediately to consult with local authorities there, including Meston, Maris, Haley, and the retired Times foreign editor, Sir Palantine Carroll, as well as with Indians. From these conferences emerged the report, written by Maris, which was issued as a Montagu-Chelmsford report in 1917. The provisions of this report were drawn up as a bill, passed by Parliament after substantial revision by a joint committee under Lord Selborne, and became the Government of India Act of 1919. The Act of 1919 was the most important law in Indian constitutional history before 1935. It divided governmental activities into central and provincial. The former included defence, foreign affairs, railways and communications, commerce, civil and criminal law and procedures, and others. The latter included public order and police, irrigation, forests, education, public health, public works, and other activities. Furthermore, the provincial activities were divided into transferred departments and reserved departments, the former being entrusted to native ministers who were responsible to provincial assemblies. The central government remained in the hands of the Governor-General and Viceroy, who was responsible to Britain and not to the Indian legislature. His Cabinet Executive Council usually had 3 Indian members after 1921. The legislature was bicameral, consisting of a Council of State and a Legislative Assembly. In both, some members were appointed officials, but the majority were elected on a very restricted suffrage. There were, on the electoral lists, no more than 900,000 voters for the lower chamber and only 16,000 for the upper chamber. The provincial unicameral legislatures had a wider, but still limited, franchise, with about 1 million on the list of voters in Bengal, half as many in Bombay. Moreover, certain seats, on the principle of weightage, were reserved to Muslims elected by a separate Muslim electoral list. Both legislatures had the power to enact laws, subject to rather extensive powers of veto and of decree in the hands of the Governor-General and the appointed provincial governors. Only the transferred departments of the provincial governments were responsible to elected assemblies, the reserved activities on the provincial level and all activities in the central administration being responsible to the appointed governors and Governor-General and ultimately to Britain. It was hoped that the Act of 1919 would provide opportunities in parliamentary procedures, responsible government, and administration to Indians so that self-government could be extended by successive steps later. But these hopes were destroyed in the disasters of 1919 to 1922. The violence of British reactionaries collided with the non-violent refusal to cooperate of Mahatma Gandhi, crushing out the hopes of the Round Table reformers between them. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi (1869–1948), known as Mahatma, or Great Soul, was the son and grandson of prime ministers of a minute princely state in western India. Of the Vaisya caste, third of the four, he grew up in a very religious and ascetic atmosphere of Hinduism. Married at 13 and a father at 15, Gandhi was sent to England to study law by his older brother when he was 17. Such a voyage was forbidden by the rules of his caste, and he was expelled from it for going. Before he left, he gave a vow to his family not to touch wine, women, or meat. After 3 years in England, he passed the bar at Inner Temple. Most of his time in Europe was passed in dilettante fads, experimenting with vegetarian diets and self-administered medicines, or in religious or ethical discussions with English faddists and Indiophiles. He was much troubled by religious scruples and feelings of guilt. Back in India in 1891, he was a failure as a lawyer because of his inarticulate lack of assurance and his real lack of interest in the law. In 1893, a Muslim firm sent him to Natal, South Africa, on a case. There Gandhi found his vocation. The population of Natal in 1896 consisted of 50,000 Europeans, mostly English, 400,000 African natives, and 51,000 Indians, chiefly outcasts. The last group had been imported from India, chiefly as indentured workers on 3- or 5-year contracts, to work the humid lowland plantations where the Negroes refused to work. Most of the Indians stayed after their contracts were fulfilled, and were so industrious and intelligent that they began to rise very rapidly in an economic sense, especially in the retail trades. The whites, who were often indolent, resented such competition from dark-skinned persons and were generally indignant at Indian economic success. As Lionel Curtis told Gandhi in the Transvaal in 1903, "It is not the vices of Indians that Europeans in this country fear, but their virtues." When Gandhi first arrived in Natal in 1893, he found that that country, like most of South Africa, was rent with colored hatred and group animosities. All political rights were in the hands of whites, while the non-whites were subjected to various kinds of social and economic discriminations and segregations. When Gandhi first appeared in court, the judge ordered him to remove his turban worn with European clothes. Gandhi refused, and left. Later, travelling on business in a first-class railway carriage to the Transvaal, he was ejected from the train at the insistence of a white passenger. He spent a bitterly cold night on the railway platform rather than move to a second or third-class compartment when he had been sold a first-class ticket. For the rest of his life he travelled only third class. In the Transvaal he was unable to get a room in a hotel because of his colour. These episodes gave him his new vocation, to establish that Indians were citizens of the British Empire and therefore entitled to equality under its laws. He was determined to use only peaceful methods of passive mass non-cooperation to achieve his goal. His chief weapon would be love and submissiveness, even to those who treated him most brutally. His refusal to fear death or to avoid pain and his efforts to return love to those who tried to inflict injuries upon him made a powerful weapon, especially if it were practiced on a mass basis. Gandhi's methods were really derived from his own Hindu tradition, but certain elements in this tradition had been reinforced by reading Ruskin, Thoreau, Tolstoy, and the Sermon on the Mount. When he was brutally beaten by whites in Natal in 1897, he refused to prosecute, saying that it was not their fault that they had been taught evil ideas. These methods gave the Indians of South Africa the temporary respite from the burden of intolerance under Gandhi's leadership in the period 1893 to 1914, when the Transvaal proposed an ordinance compelling all Indians to register, be fingerprinted, and carry identity cards at all times. Gandhi organized a mass, peaceful refusal to register. Hundreds went to jail. Smuts worked out a compromise with Gandhi. If the Indians would register voluntarily, the Transvaal would repeal the ordinance. After Gandhi had persuaded his compatriots to register, Smuts failed to carry out his part of the agreement, and the Indians solemnly burned their registration cards at a mass meeting. Then, to test the Transvaal ban on Indian immigration, Gandhi organized mass marches of Indians into the Transvaal from Natal. Others went from the Transvaal to Natal and returned, being arrested for crossing the frontier. At one time 2,500 of the 13,000 Indians in the Transvaal were in jail and 6,000 were in exile. The struggle was intensified after the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 because the Transvaal restrictions on Indians, which forbade them to own land, to live outside segregated districts, or to vote, were not repealed, and a Supreme Court decision of 1913 declared all non-Christian marriages to be legally invalid. This last decision deprived most non-white wives and children of all legal protection of their family rights. Mass civil disobedience by Indians increased, including a march by 6,000 from Natal to the Transvaal. Finally, after much controversy, Gandhi and Smuts worked out an elaborate compromise agreement in 1914. This revoked some of the discriminations against Indians in South Africa, recognized Indian marriages, annulled the discriminatory £3 annual tax on Indians, and stopped all importation of indentured labor from India in 1920. Peace was restored in this civil controversy just in time to permit a united front in the external war with Germany. But in South Africa by 1914 Gandhi had worked out the techniques he would use against the British in India after 1919. Until 1919 Gandhi was very loyal to the British connection. Both in South Africa and in India he had found that the English from England were much more tolerant and understanding than most of the English-speaking whites of middle-class origin in the overseas areas. In the Boer War he was the active leader of an 1,100-man Indian ambulance corps which worked with inspiring courage even under fire on the field of battle. During World War I, he worked constantly on recruiting campaigns for the British forces. On one of these in 1915 he said, "I discovered that the British Empire had certain ideals with which I have fallen in love, and one of these ideals is that every subject of the British Empire has the freest scope possible for his energy and honour, and whatever he thinks is due to his conscience." By 1918 this apostle of non-violence was saying, "We are regarded as a cowardly people. If we want to become free from that reproach, we should learn to use arms. Partnership in the Empire is our definite goal. We should suffer to the utmost of our ability and even lay down our lives to defend the Empire. If the Empire perishes, with it perishes our cherished aspiration." During this period Gandhi's asceticism and his opposition to all kinds of discrimination were winning him an outstanding moral position among the Indian people. He was opposed to all violence and bloodshed, to alcohol, meat, and tobacco, even to the eating of milk and eggs, and to sex even in marriage. More than this, he was opposed to Western industrialism, to Western science and medicine, and to the use of Western rather than Indian languages. He demanded that his followers make fixed quotas of homespun cotton each day, wore a minimum of homespun clothing himself, spun on a small wheel throughout all his daily activities, and took the small hand spinning wheel as the symbol of his movement, all this in order to signify the honorable nature of handwork, the need for Indian economic self-sufficiency, and his opposition to Western industrialism. He worked for equality for the untouchables, calling them God's children, Harijans, associating with them whenever he could, taking them into his own home, even adopting one as his own daughter. He worked to relieve economic oppression, organizing strikes against low wages or miserable working conditions, supporting the strikers with money he had gathered from India's richest Hindu industrialists. He attacked Western medicine and sanitation, supported all kinds of native medical nostrums and even quackery, yet went to a Western-trained surgeon for an operation when he had appendicitis himself. Similarly, he preached against the use of milk, but drank goat's milk for his health much of his life. These inconsistencies he attributed to his own weak sinfulness. Similarly, he permitted hand-spun cotton to be sewn on Singer sewing machines, and conceded that Western-type factories were necessary to provide such machines. During this period he discovered that his personal fasts from food, which he had long practiced, could be used as moral weapons against those who opposed him, while they strengthened his moral hold over those who supported him. "I fasted," he said, "to reform those who loved me. You cannot fast against a tyrant." Gandhi never seemed to recognize that his fasting and non-violent civil disobedience were effective against the British in India and in South Africa only to the degree that the British had the qualities of humanity, decency, generosity, and fair play which he most admired, but that by attacking the British through these virtues he was weakening Britain and the class which possessed these virtues, and making it more likely that they would be replaced by nations and by leaders who did not have these virtues. Certainly Hitler and the Germans, who exterminated 6 million Jews in cold blood during World War II, would not have shared the reluctance of Smuts to imprison a few thousand Indians, or Lord Halifax's reluctance to see Gandhi starve himself to death. This was the fatal weakness of Gandhi's aims and his methods. But these aims and methods were so dear to Indian hearts and so selflessly pursued by Gandhi that he rapidly became the spiritual leader of the Indian National Congress after Gokhale's death in 1915. In this position Gandhi, by his spiritual power, succeeded in something which no earlier Indian leader had achieved and few had hoped for. He spread political awareness and nationalist feeling from the educated class down into the great uneducated mass of the Indian people. This mass and Gandhi expected and demanded a greater degree of self-government after the end of World War I. The Act of 1919 provided that, and probably provided as much of it as the political experience of Indians entitled them to. Moreover, the Act anticipated expansion of the areas of self-government as Indian political experience increased. But the Act was largely a failure, because Gandhi had aroused political ambitions in great masses of Indians who lacked experience in political activities, and these demands gave rise to intense opposition to Indian self-government in British circles which did not share the ideals of the Round Table Group. Finally, the actions of this British opposition drove Gandhi from non-resistance through complete non-cooperation to civil disobedience, thus destroying the whole purpose of the Act of 1919. Many British conservatives both at home and in India opposed the Act of 1919. Lord Hampville, who had long experience in India and had valiantly supported Gandhi in South Africa, attacked the Act and Lionel Curtis for making it. In the House of Lords he said, "The incredible fact is that, but for the chance visit to India of a globe-trotting doctrinaire with a positive mania for constitution-mongering Curtis, Nobody in the world would ever have thought of so peculiar a notion as diarchy. And yet the Joint Selborne Committee tells us in an airy manner that no better plan can be conceived. In India, men like the governor of the Punjab, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, were even more emphatically opposed to Indian self-government or Indian nationalist agitation. Many conservatives who were determined to maintain the empire intact could not see how this could be done without India as the major jewel in it, as in the 19th century. India not only provided a large share of the manpower in the peacetime Imperial Army, but this army was largely stationed in India and paid for out of the revenues of the Government of India. Moreover, this self-paying manpower pool was beyond the scrutiny of the British reformer as well as the British taxpayers. The older Tories, with their strong army connections, and others, like Winston Churchill, with an appreciation of military matters, did not see how England could face the military demands of the 20th century without Indian military manpower, at least in colonial areas. Instead of getting more freedom at the end of the war in 1918, the Indians got less. The conservative group pushed through the Rowlatt Act in March 1919. This continued most of the wartime restrictions on civil liberties in India, to be used to control nationalist agitations. Gandhi called for civil disobedience and a series of scattered local general strikes held in protest. These actions led to violence, especially to Indian attacks on the British. Gandhi bewailed this violence, and inflicted the 72-hour fast on himself as penance. In Amritsar, an English woman was attacked in the street April 10, 1919. The Congress Party leaders in the city were deported, and Brigadier R.E.H. Dyer was sent to restore order. On arrival, he prohibited all processions and meetings. Then, without waiting for the order to be publicized, went with 50 men to disperse with gunfire a meeting already in progress April 13, 1919. He fired 1,650 bullets into a dense crowd packed in the square with inadequate exits, inflicting 1,516 casualties, of which 379 met death. Leaving the wounded untended on the ground, General Dyer returned to his office and issued an order that all Indians passing through the street where the English woman had been assaulted the week before must do so by crawling on hands and knees. There is no doubt that General Dyer was looking for trouble. In his own words, "I had made up my mind I would do all men to death." It was no longer a question of merely dispersing the crowd, but one of producing a sufficient moral effect from a military point of view not only on those who were present, but more especially throughout the Punjab. The situation might still have been saved from Dyer's barbarity, but the Hunter Committee, which investigated the atrocity, refused to condemn Dyer except for a grave error of judgment and an honest but mistaken conception of duty. The majority of the House of Lords approved his action by refusing to censure him, and, when the government forced him to resign from the army, his admirers in England presented him with a sword and a purse of 120,000. At this point Gandhi committed a grave error of judgment. In order to solidify the alliance of Hindu and Muslim which had been in existence since 1917, he supported the Khilafat movement of Indian Muslims to obtain the lenient peace treaty for the Turkish Sultan and Caliph following the World War I. Gandhi suggested that the Khilafat adopt non-cooperation against Britain to enforce its demands. This would have involved a boycott of British goods, schools, law courts, offices, honours, and of all goods subject to British taxes such as alcohol. This was an error of judgment because the Sultan was soon overthrown by his own people organized in a Turkish nationalist movement and seeking a secularized Turkish state, in spite of all Britain was already doing both in public and in private to support him. Thus, the Khilafat movement was seeking to force Britain to do something it already wanted to do and was not able to do. Moreover, by bringing up non-cooperation as a weapon against the British, Gandhi had opened a number of doors he had no desire to open, with very bad consequences for India. At the Indian National Congress of December 1919, Tilak and Gandhi were the leading figures. Both were willing to accept a Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, Tilak because he believed this would be the best way to prove that they were not adequate. But on August 9, 1920, Gandhi proclaimed non-cooperation in behalf of the Khilafat movement. On the same day Tilak died, leaving Gandhi as undisputed leader of the Congress. At the 1920 meeting he won unanimous approval for non-cooperation, and then moved a resolution for Swaraj self-rule either within or outside the British Empire. The Muslims in Congress, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, refused to accept an independent India outside the British Empire because this would subject the Muslims to a Hindu majority without Britain's protecting restraint. As a result, from that point, many Muslims left the Congress. Non-cooperation was a great public success, but it did not get self-rule for India, and made the country less fitted for self-rule by making it impossible for Indians to get experience in government under the Act of 1919. Thousands of Indians gave up medals and honours, gave up the practice of law in British courts, left the British schools, and burned British goods. Gandhi held great mass meetings at which thousands of persons stripped themselves of their foreign clothing to throw it on raging bonfires. This did not, however, give them training in government. It merely roused nationalist violence. On February 1, 1922, Gandhi informed the Viceroy that he was about to begin mass civil disobedience, in one district at a time, beginning in Bardoli near Bombay. Civil disobedience, including refusal to pay taxes or obey the laws, was a step beyond non-cooperation, since it involved illegal acts rather than legal ones. On February 5, 1922, a Hindu mob attacked 22 police constables and killed them by burning the police station down over their heads. In horror, Gandhi cancelled the campaign against Britain. He was at once arrested and condemned to 6 years in prison for sedition. Very great damage had been done by the events of 1919 to 1922. Britain and India were alienated to the point where they no longer trusted one another. The Congress Party itself had been split, the moderates forming a new group called the Indian Liberal Federation. The Muslims had also left the Congress Party to a large extent and gone to strengthen the Muslim League. From this point onward, Muslim Hindu riots were annual occurrences in India. And finally the boycott had crippled Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, almost 2/3 of the eligible voters refusing to vote in the council's elections of November 1920. While the Indian crisis was at its height in 1919 to 1922, an even more violent crisis was raging in Ireland. Throughout the 19th century, Ireland had been agitated by grievances of long-standing. The three major problems were agrarian, religious, and political. The Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 17th century had transferred much Irish land, as plundered of war, to absentee English landlords. In consequence, high rents, insecure tenure, lack of improvements, and legalized economic exploitation, supported by English judges and English soldiers, gave rise to violent agrarian unrest and rural atrocities against English lives and properties. Beginning with Gladstone's Land Act of 1870, the agrarian problems were slowly alleviated and, by 1914, were well in hand. The religious problem arose from the fact that Ireland was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and resented being ruled by persons of a different religion. Moreover, until the Irish Episcopal Church was disestablished in 1869, Irish Catholics had to support a structure of Anglican clergy and bishops, most of whom had few or no parishioners in Ireland and resided in England, supported by incomes from Ireland. Finally, the Act of Union of 1801 had made Ireland a part of the United Kingdom, with representatives in the Parliament at Westminster. By 1871 those representatives who were opposed to union with England formed the Irish Home Rule Party. It sought to obtain separation by obstructing the functions of Parliament and disrupting its proceedings. At times this group exercised considerable influence in Parliament by holding a balance of power between Liberals and Conservatives. The Gladstone Liberals were willing to give Ireland Home Rule, with no representatives at Westminster. The Conservatives, with the support of a majority of Englishmen, were opposed to Home Rule. The Rhodes-Milner Group wanted self-government for the Irish in their home affairs, with Irish representatives retained at Westminster for foreign and imperial matters. The Liberal government of 1906-1916 tried to enact a Home Rule Bill with continued Irish representation in the House of Commons, but was repeatedly blocked by the opposition of the House of Lords. The bill did not become law until September 1914. The chief opposition arose from the fact that Protestant Ulster Northern Ireland would be submerged in an overwhelmingly Catholic Ireland. The Ulster opposition, led by Sir Edward later Lord Carson, organized a private army, armed it with guns smuggled from Germany, and prepared to seize control of Belfast at a signal from London. Carson was on his way to the telegraph station to send this signal in 1914 when he received a message from the Prime Minister that war was about to break out with Germany. Accordingly, the Ulster Revolt was cancelled and the Home Rule Act was suspended until 6 months after the peace with Germany. As a consequence, the revolt with German arms in Ireland was made by the Irish nationalists in 1916, instead of by their Ulster opponents in 1914. This so-called Easter Revolt of 1916 was crushed and its leaders executed, but discontent continued to simmer in Ireland, with violence only slightly below the surface. In the parliamentary election of 1918, Ireland elected 6 nationalists who wanted home rule for all Ireland, 73 Sinn Féin who wanted an Irish republic free from England, and 23 Unionists who wanted to remain part of Britain. Instead of going to Westminster, the Sinn Féin organised their own parliament in Dublin. Efforts to arrest its members led to open civil war. This was a struggle of assassination, treachery, and reprisal, fought out in back alleys and on moonlit fields. 60,000 British troops could not maintain order. Thousands of lives were lost, with brutal inhumanity on both sides, and property damage rose to £50 million in value. Lionel Curtis, who helped edit the Round Table in 1919–1921, advocated in the March 1920 issue that Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland be separated and each given home rule as autonomous parts of Great Britain. This was enacted into law 8 months later as the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, but was rejected by the Irish Republicans led by Eamon de Valera. The Civil War continued. The Round Table Group worked valiantly to stop the extremists on both sides, but with only moderate success. Amory's brother-in-law, the Lord Greenwood, was appointed Chief Secretary for Ireland, the last incumbent of that post, while Curtis was appointed advisor on Irish affairs to the Colonial Office, which was headed by Milner and Amory. The Times and the Round Table condemned British repression in Ireland, the latter saying, "If the British Commonwealth can only be preserved by such means, it would become the negation of the principle for which it has stood." But British violence could not be curtailed until Irish violence could be curtailed. One of the chief leaders of the Irish Republicans was Erskine Childers, an old school boyfriend of Curtis who had been with him in South Africa, but nothing could be done through him, since he had become fanatically anti-British. Accordingly, Smuts was called in. He wrote a conciliatory speech for King George to deliver at the opening of the Ulster Parliament, and made a secret visit to the rebel hiding place in Ireland to try to persuade the Irish Republican leaders to be reasonable. He contrasted the insecurity of the Transvaal Republic before 1895 with its happy condition under Dominion status since 1910, saying, "Make no mistake about it. You have more privilege, more power, more peace, more security in such a sisterhood of equal nations than in a small, nervous republic having all the time to rely on the goodwill and perhaps the assistance of foreigners. What sort of independence do you call that? Smuts arranged an armistice and conference to negotiate a settlement. From this conference, at which Curtis was secretary, came the Articles of Agreement of December 1921, which gave Southern Ireland Dominion status as the Irish Free State, Northern Ireland continuing under the Act of 1920. The boundary line between the two countries was drawn by a committee of three, of which the British member and chairman was Richard Feetham of Milner's Kindergarten and the Round Table Group, later Supreme Court judge in South Africa. De Villiers' Irish Republicans refused to accept the settlement, and went into insurrection, this time against the moderate Irish leaders, Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. Collins was assassinated, and Griffith died, exhausted by the strain, but the Irish people themselves were now tired of turmoil. De Villiers' forces were driven underground and were defeated in the election of 1922. When De Villiers' party with Fianna Fáil did win an election in 1932 and he became President of Ireland, he abolished the oath of loyalty to the King and the office of Governor-General, ended annual payments on seized English lands and appealed to the Privy Council, engaged in a bitter tariff war with Britain, and continued to demand the annexation of Ulster. One of the last links with Britain was ended in 1938, when the British naval bases in Ayr were turned over to the Irish, to the great benefit of German submarines in 1939 to 1945.